Chapter 321. Charles woke just before noon the next day. As he stirred in the large, empty bed, he realized he was alone. In that moment, everything came back to him. "Is everyone up?" he called softly. He swung his legs over the side, stood, and left his cabin. In the corridor, each maid he passed dipped into a curtsy. "Good afternoon, Captain." "Hello, Captain." It was rare to see a man on the ship's upper 3 decks. The vessel had 7 levels in total. The top 3 above the main deck were reserved for Charles and the women under his command. Though he'd never issued a formal rule, the male crew confined themselves to the main deck and the 4 lower levels out of respect. He appreciated their thoughtfulness. By the time he reached the mess hall, it was nearly noon. Long tables were already lined with sailors sharing bowls of steaming stew from huge pots. Charles stepped up to the serving window. "I'll have one of those, please," he said to the maid inside. Charles stepped into the crew cafeteria just as the midday rush was dying down. The serving maid froze for a moment, clearly surprised to see him here. After all, officers of his rank normally ate meals specially prepared for them, not the communal, big pot stew served to ordinary sailors. But Charles had been here before and never hesitated to join the crew when he fancied a quick, hearty meal. With a practiced smile, the maid ladled a generous portion of stew into his bowl. Charles didn't mind the informal setting. Waiting for his private cook could take ages, and the cafeteria food was perfectly respectable. Though he had lived a life of privilege for more than 10 years, he carried none of the airs one might expect from a pampered aristocrat. He genuinely enjoyed these chances to share a simple meal with the crew. Balancing the steaming bowl and a slice of crusty bread on his tray, Charles scanned the room and claimed an empty table near the wall. Almost immediately, whispers spread through the dining hall. Many of the crew had joined this ship, drawn by rumors of their charismatic captain. Imagine the thrill of eating in the same room, even the same table, as their idol. Charles paid them no mind. He settled in, dipped his bread into the stew, and began to eat, just another sailor enjoying his lunch. Charles was long accustomed to curious stares. Ever since he'd mysteriously claimed the title of the world's #1 swordsman 5 years ago, nothing much surprised him. He finished the last of the galley's famous big pot rice, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and stood up. Truth be told, the meal, hearty stew, fresh vegetables, and plenty of meat, was worlds better than the bland rations he'd endured at the academy in his past life. Just then, Elena swept into the mess hall, flanked by a couple of maids. She arched an eyebrow at him. "He must be in an excellent mood today," she teased. "Our usually picky captain actually volunteered for big pot rice. The sun must be rising in the west." Charles met her gaze with a polite nod and a faint smile, choosing not to rise to the bait. Elena huffed and folded her arms. "What's so funny? Do I look like someone who can't handle a simple bowl of rice?" He shrugged, genuinely puzzled. He couldn't think of anything he'd said to offend her. Then again, everyone had their off days. With a silent nod, Charles left the dining area and made his way down the corridor to the captain's cabin. He pushed open the door to find a dozen operators diligently manning their consoles. The gentle hum of machinery filled the air. At the sight of him, all the operators stood at attention and called out in unison, "Captain!" Charles squared his shoulders, smoothed his uniform jacket, and stepped forward. Now the real work would begin. Charles tapped the console's edge to get everyone's attention. "Have you all eaten?" he asked. "The maid has already delivered our meals, and I've finished mine." The control room operators, who rarely leave their stations, nodded. They often have the maids bring food in advance, so they won't miss a beat. "Yes, sir," one of them replied. Charles inclined his head once more. "How long until we reach the next island?" The navigator glanced up from the charts. "We're still a full day's sail from the land of flowers. Barring any surprises, we should arrive by tomorrow morning." Charles acknowledged this with a firm nod and rose. His tour of the ship continued as he left the control room and made his way down the corridor to the training hall. Outside its door, the sharp echo of metal striking metal met his ears, an unmistakable sound he knew well. Pushing the door open, he found a dozen young cadets at their stations, sweat beading on their brows as they pushed weighted bars and sparred with wooden blades. Not a single one showed signs of flagging. Charles allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. He moved slowly around the room, watching each trainee's form. At the sight of their commanding officer, several cadets straightened instantly, their exhaustion replaced by renewed determination. Under Charles's steady gaze, they redoubled their efforts, hammering iron against iron with even greater intensity. Charles scanned the cluster of children around him, frowning in sudden alarm. "Where's Caesar?" he murmured under his breath. Spying Tesla not far away, he strode over and called, "Tesla, where's your brother Caesar?" Tesla froze at the sight of his father's stern face. He swallowed and hesitated under Charles's sharp gaze. "Don't try to cover for him," Charles insisted. "Where is he this time?" At last, Tesla pointed awkwardly toward a tangle of equipment. Charles marched in that direction, parting stray toys and dismantled gadgets until he spotted a familiar figure curled up and fast asleep. Caesar lay there, utterly oblivious to the racket around him. "Caesar!" Charles thundered. The name snapped Caesar awake. He jerked upright, eyes wide and panicked. "Dad!" he blurted, panic sharpening his voice. Charles folded his arms. "Feeling well rested?" he asked, tone flat. Caesar's cheeks paled, and a cold sweat broke out at his temples. He cleared his throat, searching for an excuse, any excuse, to explain how he could possibly have fallen asleep in the middle of all that noise. "Dad, what are you doing here?" Charles plastered on a confident smile, though his heart pounded in his chest. His father, Caesar, returned the look with a faint, knowing grin and laid a huge hand on Charles's shoulder. "Charles, it's been too long since we last sparred. Why don't you show me what you're made of?" Before Charles could answer, Caesar shifted his grip, throwing Charles off balance. With a grunt, Charles flew backward and landed hard inside the training ring. Caesar stepped over the rope after him. "Wait, Dad." Charles scrambled to his feet, arms raised in protest. Caesar cracked his knuckles, eyes bright with challenge. "No excuses today. I want to see your best." Before Charles could brace himself, Caesar's fist shot forward in a blur. Charles's head snapped back as the blow connected, propelling him into the ring ropes. He bounced off and hit the floor again. "Stop! Please, Dad!" Charles gasped, one hand pressed to his reddening cheek. Caesar shook his head, fury and pride warring in his expression. "Comfortable, are you? A real warrior doesn't hold back. Show me your strength." He lunged at Charles again, each punch landing with a thud. Charles's face swelled and stung with every hit, but he forced himself to stand his ground, determined not to show weakness in front of his father. "Charles!" Caesar managed to shout, but before he could finish, Charles slammed another punch into his guard. Caesar snatched his arms up just in time, yet the force still sent him sprawling across the courtyard. Straightening, Charles cracked a satisfied grin. "Not bad," he said, rubbing his knuckles. "You can dodge. Clearly you've got some real talent." Chapter 322. Charles didn't even throw his full weight behind the block, yet he managed to stop his father's strike cold. Caesar staggered backwards against the safety ropes, caught himself, and planted his feet firmly on the platform. "Dad, you're going too far," Charles called out, concern mingled with defiance in his voice. Caesar blinked, then let out a dramatic sigh. "Far? Why would I be bullying you, son?" Charles shook his head and flicked his wrist. With a dismissive grin, he shouted, "Asshole!" Enraged, Caesar lunged forward and swung a heavy punch. The blow sliced through the air with a sharp whoosh, but Charles simply tilted his head aside and let it sail past. Seizing the moment, he flicked out his leg in a swift arc. Caesar's back snapped to the point of arching, and he rocketed across the ring, slamming into the ropes before tumbling to the ground. "You've got some nerve talking to me like that, with this level of strength." Caesar roared as he staggered up, but before he could charge again, Charles hooked him by the shoulder and sent him sprawling in a neat, controlled throw. A crowd had gathered around the ring, drawn by the spectacle of father and son squaring off. Whispers rippled through the onlookers. Some of the younger students, the so-called little devils, shook their heads in sympathy, stunned that Caesar's own son had trapped him so thoroughly. At ringside, Tesla's face flushed with guilt. He watched his brother lying prone on the platform, nose bruised, cheeks swollen, and his heart tightened. This was not how he wanted things to be, but there was no denying Charles had the upper hand tonight. Charles watched Caesar's fist slam into the stone floor, the impact echoing through the chamber. Fury burned in Caesar's eyes. "Is that all you've got? You're supposed to be powerful. This is the best you can do?" A faint, unimpressed smile curved Charles's lips. He didn't flinch as Caesar lunged forward, his voice a low growl. "Don't underestimate me." In an instant, Caesar's form began to shift. His height swelled from a human's 1.7 meters to a towering 3 meters. Brilliant blue scales erupted across his skin, and his pupils narrowed into dragon-like slits. With a deafening roar, he spread his massive wings and bellowed, "Tear Sky Claw!" Razor-sharp talons slashed down toward Charles's head. But Charles stood his ground. He drew in a slow breath, lifted a single finger, and pressed it against the pad of Caesar's outstretched claw. The mighty talon froze mid-arc, suspended mere inches from Charles's face. A bead of sweat trickled down Caesar's scaled brow. "Pitiful," Charles said coolly. With the slightest of pushes, he forced Caesar's entire arm backward. The half-dragon staggered, taken aback by the boy's strength. "Is this really all your power?" Caesar's roar shook the hall as he unleashed his next attack. But Charles was already ready for him. Charles had Caesar on the ropes, literally. Every time Caesar sprang back up, Charles' next strike sent him hurtling through the air again. Over a dozen times the blow-up pickup routine repeated before Charles finally sighed in annoyance. No wonder this was the legendary Blue Dragon Phantom Beast. Its regenerative power and ironclad endurance were truly enviable. A fierce crimson light flared in Caesar's eyes, and a heavy, oppressive aura rippled across his form. He panted, muscles trembling with rage and determination. "Don't stop! Keep going! I want to see everything you've got," he roared. Charles cracked his knuckles and smiled. Caesar charged like a raging bull, roaring his challenge. Charles didn't hold back. In front of all their fellow trainees, he seized Caesar's draconic tail and slammed him against a boulder, then whipped him back and forth across the clearing. Each impact sent shockwaves through the ground. Caesar tried to resist, but gradually his strength ebbed, the crimson glow in his eyes dimmed, and with one final exhausted gasp, he reverted to his human form. Charles stood over him, chest rising and falling, hair disheveled. He shook his head and said coldly, "While everyone else trains, you took a nap? Let's see how tough you really are before you start showing off. Don't think a little strength lets you get cocky." Charles loomed over Caesar, who lay sprawled and motionless on the deck. Blood trickled from the corner of Caesar's mouth, Charles's hardest strike yet. Before today, Caesar had only returned to the barracks with a swollen nose or a black eye, but this time, everyone around fell silent, hardly daring to breathe. Moments later, a shrill cry cut through the stillness. "Charles!" Elena rushed onto the scene, her face pale with outrage. Though Caesar wasn't her biological son, she'd watched him grow since infancy, and now, seeing him beaten like this, she was furious. "Someone fetch Nanny at once," she barked. A maid sprinted off. Elena turned on Charles, hands clenched at her sides. "What on earth do you think you're doing? If you don't teach him a lesson, or know when to stop, how will he ever learn discipline? While the others train, he sprawls out on the practice dummies, asleep." She glared at Charles, demanding an explanation for this ruthless punishment. "If it weren't for the surprise inspection, I wouldn't have known." Charles stared at Caesar's prone form. Despite the worry knotting in his chest, he couldn't hide his contempt. "He's just sleeping. Why make such a fuss?" Elena hurried forward, and Martha sank to her knees beside her son, wrapping him in a trembling embrace. "I'm only doing this to teach him a lesson," she sobbed. "He's gone and killed a few inexperienced pirates, and now he thinks he's invincible. He's only tasted victory on the shallow end of the Grand Line, but he's already acting like a king. As my Rockefeller son, his future is precarious. At this rate, his arrogance will be his undoing, and he'll take others down with him." Charles bristled at Martha's words, resentment flaring in his gaze. Caesar's eyelids fluttered. He tried to speak, but a fresh gush of blood stained his lips. With a soft thud, he collapsed, unconscious once more. "Caesar! Caesar!" Martha's cry echoed through the chamber, but her son lay still. Footsteps pounded on the stone corridor, and Nakin burst in, alarm etched across his face. He rushed over, his eyes widening at the sight of Caesar's bloodied cheek. Cautiously, he turned to Charles and Martha, then knelt beside the stricken pirate. After a tense moment of examination, he exhaled in relief. "He's alive," Nakin announced. "But we need to get him to a medic, now." Martha nodded, tears still glistening on her lashes. Charles took a step forward, his anger momentarily forgotten as they lifted Caesar together, urgency propelling them down the corridor. After applying the healing salve to Caesar's grazed skin, Nurse Nikin rose and addressed Mrs. Martha with a reassuring smile. "Don't worry, madam. Caesar's wounds are only superficial, just a few scrapes. With a couple of days' rest, he'll be back on his feet." Mrs. Martha let out a long, tremulous breath. Relief washed over her face for the first time in hours. Standing just behind them, Charles frowned. He had disciplined his son, and done it quite harshly, by his own standards. But he'd felt a flare of anger when he saw Caesar dozing through the drills. Everyone else was pushing themselves to the limits, while his only heir took an easy nap. That was unacceptable, Charles had convinced himself in the moment. And yet, now that the deed was done, he regretted it. Aware that Lady Leanna would soon scold him for making a scene, Charles turned away and strode from the pavilion. No one dared follow or linger once their captain had departed. The brief family drama ended as abruptly as it had begun. Elena and 2 other attendants gently lifted Caesar onto a stretcher and carried him off toward the infirmary. On the training field, the clatter of armor and shouts of exertion rose to a fever pitch. Everyone seemed determined to outwork any hint of weakness, especially now that their captain had set such a stern example. Chapter O. Nay, Charles's lesson. Charles had once again managed to transform his lesson into something almost reverent in the eyes of his classmates. He paced before them with the air of a stern mentor, determined to prove a simple truth. Mastering the art of laziness is no easy feat. It demands its own special kind of strength. As the children settled onto the floor around him, Charles raised a single finger. "You might think that being lazy means doing nothing," he began, his voice calm but firm. "But true laziness requires careful planning. You have to conserve energy, anticipate every obstacle, and know just when to act. That kind of discipline isn't easy. It takes strategy, sometimes more than working from dawn till dusk." A hush fell over the circle. Eyes big and bright, the other students leaned in as Charles continued. He described the virtues of conserving one's energy, of taking each step only when absolutely necessary, and of plotting a course that would let you achieve the most with the least wasted effort. To them, it sounded almost like a martial art. "So remember," Charles concluded, offering a slight, knowing smile, "laziness isn't about doing nothing. It's about doing exactly what you need to, and nothing more." With that, he reclined against the classroom wall, already satisfied that he had elevated what others saw as mere idleness into a lesson worthy of their highest respect. Chapter 323, The Kingdom of Flowers. Since Charles soundly defeated Caesar, the rest of the crew has thrown themselves into training with unprecedented zeal. No longer does he need to chase after them or bark orders to keep them in line. Still, he isn't foolish enough to believe this excitement will last forever. If they grow complacent, he'll make sure they understand exactly why roses are red. Caesar's public thrashing served as a stark warning. No one is above discipline. Charles had been itching to set these kids straight ever since they left Kamei Island. They'd already crossed the North Sea, and now they'd sailed into the fabled West Sea, eyes wide at every new wonder, pride swelling in their chests. Fresh from dominating the Four Seas rookie village, they'd started charging recklessly into any skirmish. A pirate flag on the horizon? They'd rush it head first. A naval frigate standing in their way? Why not provoke it? Such hot-headed bravado might thrill them now, but unchecked it would cost lives. Today's session would be different. As dawn broke over the fragrant fields of the so-called Flower Kingdom, Charles gathered the crew on the deck. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and wild roses drifting in from shore, a gentle contrast to the stern lesson he intended to deliver. "Listen up," he called, voice steady. "Strength and skill are important, but so is discipline. A true sailor knows when to hold back, when to strike, and most of all, when to follow orders. Today, we're not just training our bodies, we're forging our character. Mistakes will happen, but from now on, every misstep costs you something. Your pride, your time, or even a turn at the next mission." Heads bowed in respect and a hint of nervous excitement. They knew Charles meant business. As the sun climbed higher, the crew lined up for drills that would test not only their fighting prowess, but their ability to think, to obey, and above all, to trust one another. This was just the beginning. In the Kingdom of Flowers, only those who mastered both blade and discipline would truly bloom. Charles was carried off by Elena and the others, and under Pharmacist Niken's care, he'd already regained more than half his strength. Now he lay on the infirmary bed, staring blankly up at the ceiling. His mother, Jillian, hovered by his side, tears of worry glistening in her eyes. "Charles," she whispered, voice trembling. He didn't move or answer. "Elena, maybe we should give him some space," one of the girls offered softly. Elena nodded and gave Jillian a gentle tug on the sleeve. "Let him sort things out in his own time." Gillian glanced at her son, then bowed her head in resignation. When she looked up again, her voice was firmer. "All right, Charles, rest now. I won't pester you anymore. Don't blame your father. He only pushed you so hard because he wants you to become a dragon and carry our family's hopes. You must promise me you won't be lazy again." She straightened the quilt around him, lips trembling as she fought back more tears. With Elena supporting her arm, she turned and left the room. The other girls exchanged troubled looks, silently hoping Charles would find his own resolve. At last, the ward quieted. Charles lay alone in the muted light, memories of the training hall flooding back, his father's angry shouts, the cold crack of the whip, the expression of disappointment etched on that proud face. Bitterness and shame coiled in his chest until he shut his eyes, shutting out the world. Word of the upheaval in the training room had spread swiftly through the ship. Everyone now knew the shocking truth. Charles had been beaten by his own father. Chapter X. Arrival at the Kingdom of Flowers. A fierce quarrel had broken out the night before between Captain Harland and his only son, Charles, leaving the entire ship under a cloud of tension. No one dared approach Charles in his sour mood, and the evening ended in awkward silence. At first light the next morning, Annette, Charles's maid, knocked gently on his cabin door. "Your Highness, we've reached the Kingdom of Flowers," she announced. Charles stirred and sat up in bed. "Very good. Give me 20 minutes. We'll stay here a few days to resupply." He'd been eager for this port ever since he first heard its name. Only here, he believed, might he uncover echoes of the life he couldn't remember. By the time he stepped onto deck, a clear, chilly winter sky had brightened the harbor. Frost still dusted the ropes and railings, and the cold air sharpened everyone's steps. Dock workers hurried to and fro, unloading cargo, hauling barrels, and setting up market stalls. As their ship drew alongside the quay, Charles's gaze was caught by another vessel already at anchor, a massive three-masted bark with black sails, dwarfing every boat in the harbor. Its hull, a dark, gleaming expanse, seemed to absorb the pale morning light. At the sight of it, a small band of stowaway boys, known among the crew as the Little Ghosts, froze in terror. Whispers of that shadowy ship had been circulating for weeks. Now, hearing its ropes creak against the quay, the boys bolted below deck, slipping out of sight like wraiths. Charles frowned, curiosity piqued. This unexpected arrival could mean trouble or opportunity. Either way, his first chance to explore the Kingdom of Flowers had just become a great deal more interesting. Almost everyone awoke at dawn and poured out onto the deck, chattering excitedly about the world beyond the walls of the ship. Charles emerged among them, a little straighter than before, but noticeably slower on his feet. As soon as his brothers and sisters spotted him, they shouted greetings and apologies. "I'm sorry, Charles. I betrayed you yesterday," called Tesla, his voice catching with relief. Since the incident, Tesla had been trying to find a moment to say sorry, only to be shooed away by several of the mothers on board. Now he seized the chance to sprint forward. Charles met his second brother with a gentle smile and shook his head. "Don't worry about it. Truth is, I deserved worse. I've grown used to a good beating by now." Tesla's shoulders sagged, the weight of his guilt lifting. "Brother, are you really all right?" Charles laughed softly and ruffled Tesla's hair. "Of course, I'm fine. Let's not linger here. We've waited long enough. Come on, everyone. Let's go ashore and explore the island." With that, Charles led the way down the gangplank, his younger siblings clustering around him, eager to finally set foot on solid ground and discover the wonders that lay ahead. Charles stood quietly at the bow of the ship, looking down at the cluster of children playing on the deck. A faint smile tugged at his lips. He was clearly in a good mood. One of the kids stopped mid-laugh and pointed up at him. "Hey, you're always the smooth talker. So why'd you go and make things so awkward between you and your dad?" Tianyu stepped forward and draped a cloak around Charles's shoulders. "You don't understand," she said softly. "This is how father and son bond." Charles slipped his arms around her waist and looked up at her. Tianyu raised an eyebrow. "He's still just a child," she reminded him, amusement dancing in her eyes. He grinned. "All the more reason to start an adventure early. After breakfast, let's set sail for the Kingdom of Flowers. We'll pay a visit to the most powerful nation in the West Sea." With that, Charles gave Tianyu a playful squeeze and led the way toward the dining hall, where a lively crowd was already sharing the morning meal. Meanwhile, in the storied realm of the Kingdom of Flowers, a corpulent, sallow-faced man with a faint greenish hue to his skin reclined in an ornate chair. He glowered down at his underlings. "What are you spouting now?" he barked. "The Rockefeller pirates showed up here? Stop feeding me fairy tales." Minoru dropped to one knee, urgency written on his face. "Commander, I swear I'm not mistaken. I followed you into the New World. That ship in the harbor is the sea god Poseidon of the Rockefeller pirates." Charles's eyes snapped open. He sat, bolt upright. "I've been hearing rumors for days that the Rockefeller pirates have pushed into the Western Sea, hunting down every pirate crew in their path. I thought it was idle gossip. Apparently, I was wrong. If they're as fierce as they say, we must warn the Imperial Palace at once. Should they clash with our navy unprepared, the casualties will be catastrophic." His hand unconsciously brushed the jagged scar across his brow, a remnant of the duel 8 years past. The memory of that day, his shattered defenses, the blinding pain, still fueled his resolve. "Sound the horn. All officers mount up and follow me to the palace," Charles barked, scrambling to his feet. Officers and sailors surged to obey. As Charles strode toward the docks, an astonished crowd gathered. Whispers rippled through the onlookers. "What's gotten into him? He's never moved this fast before. I heard he's been listless ever since returning from the New World. Now he's charging off like a man possessed." But Charles paid them no mind. His focus was fixed on the distant Imperial Palace, where he would alert the court to the Rockefeller threat and prepare to face the sea god Poseidon head-on. "I'm not sure what's happened, but he looks desperate. Something's definitely wrong. Let's hurry. The court session is about to start." At the minister's words, he swept inside without another word. Chapter 324, Hometown. "What do you mean, sire?" "The Rockefeller pirates, those notorious marauders from the New World, have been sighted in our kingdom's port." In the grand audience hall of the Flower Kingdom's palace, the emperor sat upon his dragon-carved throne, his golden robes gleaming beneath crystal chandeliers. Across the polished marble floor stood General Qingjiao, bowing deeply as he delivered the startling news. All at once, the chamber erupted in anxious murmurs. How did they slip past our navy and reach the West Sea at all? "This is an outrage. Mobilize the army at once. We cannot let those pirates ravage our people. With their cruelty, the Flower Kingdom will be laid to waste if we delay." Ministers rose to their feet, hawkish eyes blazing as they clamored for immediate action. But before their shouts could grow any louder, the emperor raised a single hand. "Enough!" His voice rang out, firm and commanding, cutting through the cacophony. At his side, the chief eunuch, Dai Lin, leaped up and snapped his fingers to restore order. "The Rockefeller pirates are led by Charles Rockefeller himself," the emperor went on, his gaze sweeping the assembled court. "We know his reputation. He fights without mercy, and his name is feared even in the farthest reaches of the New World. We cannot underestimate him." A hush fell over the hall. Outside, the sea breeze carried the faint cry of gulls, an eerie reminder that the enemy was already at their doorstep. The fate of the Flower Kingdom would be decided in the coming days, and the imperial court braced itself for the storm about to break. An imposing aura from the throne fell over the court, and every minister fell silent. The emperor fixed his cold gaze on General Charles. "General Charles, tell me honestly, do you believe your famed 8-treasure fleet can withstand the Rockefeller pirates?" Charles felt his knees weaken. He'd spent years deceiving the court with tales of his navy's prowess, but now the emperor stood before him in person. A bead of sweat slid down Charles's temple as dread coiled in his stomach. He opened his mouth to answer, then suddenly found himself mute. The emperor's frown deepened. He already sensed the truth. "Summon all the other naval commanders," he commanded. "We will hold an immediate council." Throughout the West Sea, this kingdom reigned as the foremost maritime power. Its naval strength, strong enough to earn even the world government's cautious respect, had always been its greatest asset. But Charles's silence suggested that reputation might now be at risk. Moments later, 6 armored admirals filed into the main hall with measured steps. Their stern faces and polished breastplates spoke of countless sea battles. At the emperor's nod, they knelt in unison. "Your Majesty," they intoned, awaiting orders. The throne room fell into a tense hush as Emperor Wu surveyed his assembled generals and ministers. At the center of the carved marble dais stood I Ching-ping, alongside several other envoys, each summoned by imperial decree. With a single, deliberate sweep of his cloak, the emperor signaled for silence. "General Ching-ping," he began, fixing his gaze on the seasoned commander, "you surely understood why I called you here today. Our dilemma is this. Do we drive out the Rockefeller pirates or simply turn a blind eye to their incursions?" A ripple of murmurs spread through the hall before the emperor's eyes settled on Qingjiao, the young scout who had just returned from the newly discovered realms. Qingjiao knew better than most the true strength of these privateers. Stepping forward crisply, Qingjiao spoke with measured confidence. "Your Majesty, the Rockefeller pirates are no ordinary band of marauders. Their numbers matter, of course, but it is their network of alliances and the loyalty they inspire that makes them so dangerous. To confront them head-on would risk grave losses." The emperor tapped his ivory armrest and nodded. He had heard enough to recognize both Qingjiao's insight and her valor. A hard choice lay before, but one option now seemed clear. "Very well," he announced. "Qingjiao, you will lead a diplomatic mission to the Rockefeller fleet. Extend our hand in friendship, convey the Flower Kingdom's goodwill, and explore what terms they might accept. We shall seek to bind them as allies, not enemies." As the courtiers shifted in their seats, the emperor rose, signaling the end of the council. Outside, the afternoon light glinted off polished armor, a reminder that, whether by sword or by treaty, the fate of the realm now rested in Qingjiao's capable hands. "I wonder how many of our generals truly share in my concerns," the emperor mused, his gaze sweeping the silent assembly. A heavy stillness settled over the hall. None dared to meet his eyes, yet no one dared to dissent. At last, Minister Liang bowed deeply. "Your Majesty, I stand ready to share your worries." The council had spent the entire morning debating Charles, and every officer present felt a cold sweat prickling down his back. When the session ended, General Qingjiao strode from the throne room, jaw set. Awaiting him at the palace gates were the officers of the 8 Treasures Navy, their uniforms gleaming in the morning light. One young commander, dubbed Green Pepper for his quick temper, stepped forward. "General, you're our only man who's been to the New World and faced the Rockefeller pirates. What of them? Do they threaten the Kingdom of Flowers?" Green Pepper considered the question, frowning. "Their reputation is formidable," he said at last. "Yet despite their name, they operate with a strict code of conduct. They're not the lawless brutes we feared." A collective sigh of relief rose among the officers. Qingjiao nodded once. "Very good. Prepare the fleet immediately. We set sail for the Rockefeller pirates' last known coordinates, and we bring me Charles Rockefeller." Unaware that the Kingdom of Flowers had just marked his name, Charles Rockefeller continued his voyage across the open sea. Charles had already led several of his relatives through the gates into the bustling capital of the Flower Kingdom. Truly, this realm, renowned as the largest in the West Sea, lived up to its reputation for prosperity. As Charles wandered down the crowded streets, he took in sights and sounds unlike any he'd encountered before. Vendors shouted their wares, townspeople bustled past, and even the poorest beggars and orphans wore hopeful expressions. It was plain evidence that the king here ruled with both wisdom and compassion. Suddenly, a comforting aroma drifted through the air, smoky and savory, redolent of childhood meals long left behind. Charles stopped dead in his tracks, tears pricking at his eyes. "That's it," he whispered. "Come on, let's go." He pointed eagerly toward a small eatery with curling wisps of steam escaping its doorway. With each step he drew closer, the scent grew stronger and more familiar. Home. Without a second thought, Charles slipped onto a wooden bench at the first table inside, ignoring the curious glances of nearby patrons. "Shopkeeper," he called, voice trembling with anticipation. "May I have your special dish, please? Bring out your house specialties." Charles called the moment they'd sat down. "Right away, sir," the waiter replied, departing at the sharp command. The confidence in Charles's voice surprised even himself and settled him more comfortably into his seat. Across the table, Elena and the other girls exchanged curious glances. They'd traveled with Charles for nearly 10 years, but they'd never seen him quite so enthusiastic. Elena leaned forward. "Charles, is there something special about this place?" Charles grinned. "Oh, definitely. This country is different in so many ways, and it holds a lot of meaning for me." Before anyone could ask more, the waiter returned, laying out a simple feast of youtiao, sesame flatbreads, and steaming bowls of hot and sour soup. Charles's eyes lit up. After a decade of barbecue joints and Western cafes, he hadn't tasted an authentic Chinese breakfast in ages. He inhaled deeply and whoosh, plunged his chopsticks into the soup. Liana and the others looked on, bewildered. Weren't they already full from the breakfast they just shared? Clearly, Charles had other plans. And as the savory aroma of dough sticks and spicy broth filled the air, it was easy to see why. Charles had already plunged in and started eating before anyone else could react. Elena watched him for a moment, amused by how enthusiastically he devoured each bite, and finally picked up a spoon herself. The flavor was perfectly fine, but she couldn't understand why Charles found it so irresistible. A group of island children soon clustered around the stall, eyeing the plates hungrily, yet none of them had actually eaten. One little boy tugged at his father's sleeve and called out, "Dad, can I have some too?" Before the man could answer, Charles stood and raised his voice toward the vendor. "Hey, could you bring over a few more bowls, please?" At that, the other children scrambled for the empty seats at Charles's table, chattering in excitement as they settled in to wait for their food. Elena smiled and nudged her daughter. Let their father and son sort out the bowls, she thought. The two of them could finish their meal in peace, at least for a little while. Chapter 325. The arena breakfast had barely touched Charles's lips when a faint flicker of memory surged through him. He paused mid-bite, staring at the narrow street outside with a strange mix of familiarity and distance. Letting out a soft sigh, he murmured under his breath, "I can't go back. Not anymore." The young women around him exchanged puzzled glances, but Charles's expression was resolute enough that no one pressed him for an explanation. At last, he straightened in his seat. "All right, everyone, let's head out again. But remember, no trouble today." Robert and the other boys blinked in surprise. Their father hardly ever let them roam freely, and now he was warning them not to cause mischief? They looked at Charles, baffled, but obedience won out curiosity. After all, yesterday's chaos was still fresh in their minds. Soon, more than 20 of Charles's entourage spilled onto the bustling street. Passers-by couldn't help but notice the diverse little procession. Graceful young ladies, sharply dressed gentlemen, and a clutch of adorable, wide-eyed children trailing behind. There was something ineffably commanding about their air, an aura of quiet superiority that made the crowds part respectfully to avoid any awkward run-ins. Charles, however, paid their stares no mind. With his hand resting casually on his sword hilt, he led the group forward, the morning sun glinting off polished armor and shimmering silks. Today, they would go shopping, and this time with a firm promise of peace on all sides. Charles rounded the corner, and chaos. "Move it! Clear the street! The 8 Treasures Navy is coming!" a frantic voice hollered. In an instant, the crowded thoroughfare emptied. Only a handful of vendors stayed at their booths, tossing anxious glances at the approaching commotion. From a distance, Charles made out a middle-aged man striding forward, flanked by several armored captains and a dozen armed sailors. The leader's expression was grim. Business, not leisure. Charles didn't need a second look to recognize him. "Hey, isn't this Green Pepper?" Charles called out, striding forward with mock surprise. "Last I heard, Carp gave you a beating 2 years ago. Whatever happened to that proud little top knot of yours? Looks like it's gone missing. The man called Green Pepper froze mid-step, his jaw clenching. At Charles's words, his features twisted with sudden fury. Carp's name still struck a raw nerve, and the loss of his trademark hair spike was a deeper humiliation than any wound. His captains tensed, hands drifting to hilts, but before they could react, their leader, Green Pepper himself, leaned back from drawing his sword. A bead of sweat ran down the side of his face as he stared daggers at Charles. His closest officers exchanged worried glances, reaching out to hold him back. They knew a single swing from their captain could turn this street into a battlefield. Charles gave a mocking bow. No hard feelings, right? Just catching up. But Green Pepper's eyes burned with shame and rage. With one last snarl, his officers forced him to step aside, keeping him from charging Charles on the spot. The street lay silent again, tension crackling in the air, an unspoken warning that their confrontation was far from over. Since the Navy had sent Qingjiao away, the very name Garp had become taboo in the Kingdom of Flowers. Anyone who dared speak it risked incurring Qingjiao's wrath. Even now, his subordinates gripped him firmly, but he didn't erupt. He simply fixed Charles with a fierce glare, the scar on his sword hand lending his expression a savage edge. "Charles, what brings you to the Kingdom of Flowers?" Qingjiao asked in a low, controlled voice, as if Charles's presence alone had dared him to speak. Charles smiled and shrugged. "Purpose? I'm just here to see the sights. Planning to stop me?" Those words stoked Qingjiao's anger, but he managed to hold himself in check. He stared at Charles without a word, each silent second growing more intense. Charles simply watched him back, amusement flicker, ing in his eyes. Finally, Qingjiao spoke again, quieter but no less threatening. "Mark my words, the Kingdom of Flowers is a vital member of the world government. Should anything happen here, the Navy will descend within half a day. You'd better keep yourself safe," Admiral Qingjiao warned Charles, though his voice quivered with uncertainty. Charles caught that tremor. He knew the Admiral's real frustration was reserved for the bungling West Sea Fleet, not for him. He offered a confident smile. "Don't worry, Admiral. I promise I won't make any rash moves, so long as you don't give me a reason to." With a casual wave to Little Pepper, Charles dismissed the matter. Qingjiao studied him for a moment, then let out a relieved sigh. After all, Charles had proven himself a man of his word, far from the ruthless pirates the Admiral distrusted. Still, Qingjiao followed at a discreet distance. It wasn't that he feared for Charles's safety. He simply worried that some hot-headed fool might provoke the young man and drag the Kingdom of Flowers into needless trouble. Charles paid him no mind and simply allowed Green Pepper to trail along a respectful distance behind. As they strolled through the Flower Kingdom's busy streets, the crowd swelled again. There was always something new and delightful to see here, and Charles was enjoying the outing with his family. From afar, Green Pepper watched this unhurried pirate lord of the New World wandering through foreign markets and gardens. Surely Charles knew his own territory back home risked erosion while he played tourist? Their path led them to an immense edifice that had first caught Charles's eye as soon as his boat slipped into port. He paused on the steps and let out a low whistle. "Is this the arena?" he asked, his tone a mixture of curiosity and excitement. In that single instant, Charles felt an almost instinctive surge of clarity. He saw, as if in a vision, the roar of the crowd and the flash of glinting weapons under the midday sun. "Fantastic," he murmured. "We've actually come to the famed Flower Kingdom arena. We can't miss the chance to watch a match." He motioned to his family, and they joined the line of eager spectators. After paying their admission fees, they entered the vast amphitheater. Climbing the steeply tiered seating, Charles secured a spot on the upper platform, a perfect vantage point. He sank into his seat, heart racing in anticipation, ready for the gladiatorial spectacle to unfold. Charles watched two figures locked in fierce combat on the arena stage. Their clashing swords had the stands erupting with cheers and shouts. "This is Bao Shi's 30th straight victory. Can he break the all-time record?" one spectator cried. "Bah, Bao Shi's nothing. I've met someone who ran off 100 wins in a row. His skill makes Bao Shi look like a novice," another retorted. "Don't be so quick to dismiss him," a third voice fired back. Over 10 years ago, Captain Green Pepper of the Flower Kingdom held the consecutive win record. That was on a whole other level compared to Bao Shi. Charles heard the banter and glanced over to see Captain Green Pepper seated nearby, watching the match with a knowing calm. Beside him, his younger daughter Qingjiao stared at the stage, then found a seat and settled in, eyes wide with excitement. "Dad, can I jump in and try?" His elder daughter Estes suddenly burst out, her fighting spirit barely contained. She eyed the two combatants as if the arena had been built just for her moment to shine. With one hand drifting to the hilt of her sword, Estes grinned at her father. Charles met her gaze and gave a gentle nod. "All right, go for it." Chapter Kenks, Forging the Blade. Charles watched Estes move through her drills with a critical eye, his arms folded across his chest. Sweat gleamed on her forehead as her sword carved precise arcs through the morning air, yet something was off. Today, she'd come up against a hard boundary, unable to advance beyond the threshold that separates a skilled swordswoman from a true master. He stepped into the clearing, boots crunching softly on gravel. "You've hit a bottleneck," he said, voice calm but firm. "If you break through it, the realm of master swordsmen will finally lie within your reach. But it won't happen on its own." Estes paused, breathing heavily. "I understand the theory," she admitted, "but I've practiced every day, sparred with dozens of opponents. Why can't I surpass this point?" Charles sheathed his sword and motioned her to follow him to a pair of wooden dummies. "Because you're still searching for direction. You swing without purpose. A blade without intent is like a body without a soul." He paused, letting his words sink in. "To refine your style, you must test yourself against more varied opponents. Each fight teaches you something new, about timing, distance, and your own spirit. Only then will your sword speak with its own voice." Estes stared at her weapon, the weight of his critique settling over her like a shroud. She hadn't realized her confusion ran so deep. Now, with clarity at last, she understood what held her back. She nodded, determination flaring in her eyes. "I see it now. I know what I must do." Charles offered a rare approving smile. "Good, then let's get to work." Chapter 326. Estes staggered out of the arena, her sword arm hanging limply at her side, confusion etched on her young face. Opposite her stood 12-year-old Charles, brow furrowed in frustration. He'd tried to explain the subtleties of his unorthodox sword technique during their bout, but words fell short. All he could hope was that Estes had grasped enough to adapt it herself. Otherwise, she might remain forever confined to the limits of a conventional swordsman's skill. Drawing a deep breath, Estes made her way to the registration booth. The clerk glanced up, surprise and concern flickering in his eyes as he saw how small and slight the girl was. "Are you sure you want to enter the next round? The arena's dangerous. Every year, countless challengers don't make it out alive." "I'm sure," Estes replied, her voice steady and resolute. "Sign me up for the next match. Whether I live or die is my own concern." The clerk opened his mouth to argue, but faltered beneath Estes's unwavering gaze. With a reluctant nod, he recorded her name in the ledger. At the edge of the crowd, Qingjiao, who'd been shadowing Charles since the beginning of the competition, watched the exchange with mounting unease. She beckoned urgently to her aid. Whatever Charles had in mind, she was determined to stay one step ahead. By the way, Green Pepper still hadn't forgotten Charles's elder sister. After all, it's rare for someone so young to awaken a Bong-level domineering aura. In the New World, there may be countless Bawang dominators, but few do so at an early age, and the fact that she was Charles's sister made the feat all the more memorable. Not long after, Green Pepper's subordinates returned with surprising news. Charles himself had signed up to fight in the arena. Green Pepper was momentarily taken aback. He glanced at Charles, puzzled by the boy's decision. Perhaps he simply couldn't resist the urge to test himself. In any case, the serpent leader of the Flower Nation said nothing more. He merely instructed his staff to carry on with the usual preparations. Green Pepper knew the arena inside and out, but Charles looked on with detached disinterest. Below them, the combatants clashed like a flock of squabbling chickens, hardly exciting to Charles's eyes. The spectators around him, however, leaned forward in rapt attention, utterly absorbed in the fight. Bao Yi's latest opponent barely registered before he wiped the arena floor with him, chalking up his 30th straight victory. The announcer's next call caught Charles's attention. Next match, Bao Yi versus Estes. Contestants, please report to the staging area. Battle begins in 10 minutes. A ripple of excitement passed through the crowd. During the break, spectators crowded around the betting boards, placing their wagers. After all, Bao Yi had a 30-win streak. Nobody wanted to bet against him. The odds against Estes were sky-high, and most viewers had never even heard of the newcomer. Still, a handful of bold gamblers put down their credits, hoping for a surprise upset. 10 minutes later, the doors slid open, and two figures stepped into the center ring. The roar of the crowd swelled as Bao Yi and the mysterious Estes took their marks, ready to clash in what promised to be the arena's most talked-about bout yet. "He's a little boy." A collective gasp swept through the arena as Charles stepped into the ring. Laughter and jeers erupted from the spectators, especially the gamblers who'd wagered everything on his opponent. "Of course the odds were so low," one sneered. "You don't bet on children," another hollered triumphantly. High above them on the raised platform, Charles heard every insult but didn't flinch. With quiet resolve, he slid his hand to the hilt of his sword and drew it free. The blade caught the sun in a cold blue flash. Along its edge gleamed a thin frost, like winter's own breath frozen into steel. It was a famed Western longsword, renowned throughout the realm for its icy power. Across the ring, his adversary, Bao Yi, froze. A sudden chill crept along his spool, as he stared at the frosted blade. He'd heard the legends, how that sword could slice through the toughest defense as if it were mist. Bao Yi's eyes glittered with equal parts greed and apprehension. To a seasoned swordsman, the sight of a legendary weapon was both a temptation and a warning, and Charles now held all the advantage. Charles had long suspected that few swordsmen ever treated a saber like a common tool. Fine blades were treasures, shopkeepers' most precious wares, seldom offered for sale. Realizing he faced such a weapon jolted him fully alert. His opponent was no ordinary duelist. Across the dusty courtyard, Estes, a lithe, twin-bladed swordswoman, returned his scrutiny with equal wariness. Duel wielders were rare, neither moved for 3 heartbeats, each probing the other's intent. Without a word, Estes struck. Her long sword whipped forward in a lethal arc, the steel singing through the sunlit air. A cold gleam cut toward Charles's chest, and despite the summer heat, he felt a shiver trace his spine. He flicked up one of his knives just in time. The blades met in a thunderous clang, pain jolting through his wrist as they locked. His arm trembled under the force. Never had he met strength like this. Blinking up at the petite swordswoman before him, Charles's heart pounded. She might look slight, but her skill and power were undeniable. He would need every ounce of his wits and will to stand against her. From the look of her face, Bao Yi could tell she was barely out of her teens, yet every ounce of her strength surpassed that of a seasoned middle-aged swordsman. "You little devil! Who are you? Why has no one in the Kingdom of Flowers ever heard of you?" Bao Yi barked, retreating a step and raising his blade in defense. Estes offered no answer. With a single, fluid motion, she struck again, so swift and precise that his guard shattered, his tunic split open, and a knife-cold breeze grazed his skin. Realizing questions would cost him the match, Bao Yi stifled his demand for answers and poured all his concentration into defense. But the harder he pressed, the more the panic grew. Her footwork was impeccable, her swordplay punishing from every angle, driving him relentlessly toward the edge of the ring. "My blade dishonors the rules?" he gasped, voice trembling, as he staggered backward. Esdeth's only reply was a contemptuous flick of the wrist. The next slash sent Bao Yi tumbling off the platform. He hit the ground below with a thud, chest heaving, and looked up at Esdeth standing triumphant above him, disbelief frozen on his face. He had lost, and lost utterly. The crowd froze in stunned silence at what they'd just witnessed. Then, as reality set in, a thunderous chorus of outrage erupted from the stands. "This is a sham! A sham!" Spectators bellowed, pounding their fists in the air. There's no way this fight was real. They glared up at Esdeth, standing calmly on the elevated platform, scarcely able to believe that someone so slight could have toppled Bao Yi, the undefeated champion with 33 victories to his name. Chapter 27, Barrett's Challenge. A wave of outrage rippled through the arena. Spectators jeered and stamped their feet, unable to accept that a young boy had just beaten Bao Yishi, the undefeated champion with 33 straight wins. From his seat on the dais, Qingjiao's brow tightened as he watched the commotion on the stage. He knew exactly what was going on. Wealthy patrons had wagered heavily on Bao Yishi, only to see all their money dashed when an unlikely competitor, Charles, had emerged victorious. The uproar grew louder the closer it came to Charles, still seated calmly after his triumphant roar in the field. Qingjiao glanced at the angry crowd below and then back at the boy. He wasn't worried about the bettor's fury so much as he feared their insults might reach Charles and provoke him. Worse yet, any rash reaction in the arena could draw the ire of the royal family members who discreetly held sway behind the scenes. "Quick, send the order to the stewards," Qingjiao hissed to his aides. "Get those spectators under control before this escalates further." He knew the arena's politics were treacherous. With royals lurking in the shadows, any heavy-handed intervention could backfire. Still, he had no choice. He had to protect Charles and keep the peace, no matter the risk. Estes sheathed his sword and turned to face the roaring crowd. "Sorrow of the fool," he proclaimed, his voice cutting through the din. His declaration barely registered above the audience's cheers, but a few nearby swordsmen, among them Esdeath's fiercest rivals, glared at her with barely concealed envy. Bao Shi rose to his feet, his expression a tangle of grudging respect and wounded pride. He had just been bested by a 12-year-old girl, and the sting of defeat left his heart unsettled. Estes' gaze shifted from the crowd to Bao Shi. "You're not bad yourself," he said coolly, "but you're too fixated on what's right in front of you." With that, he sheathed his blade, stepped off the dais, and strode toward the registration table. As he signed up for the next round, he vowed aloud, "I'll challenge every swordsman in the Kingdom of Flowers and beat them all right here on this stage." Charles stretched and watched Estes go without the slightest surprise. Given Esdeath's phenomenal kendo talent, this outcome had been inevitable. At only 12 years old, she had already climbed to the very summit of swordsmanship, just one step shy of true mastery. Her raw gift even surpassed his own, and Charles could only shake his head in awe as he turned his attention to the matches ahead. Thanks to Dad's guidance over the past few years, and combined with Esdeath's devil fruit power, even a seasoned major general would have little chance against her. As I watched my eldest sister's dazzling solo performance in the ring, the rest of us simply couldn't keep quiet. "Dad, let me challenge her next," the younger ones cried out in unison. Tesla and Robert, their eyes alight with excitement, couldn't wait to test themselves. I knew exactly what they were thinking. "Go on, then," Dad called, smiling. "But be careful. If you can win, finish the match. If not, tap out right away. You're still young, and I don't expect you to beat her. I'll be right here watching." "Yes, Dad," Tesla and Robert replied together, then dashed off toward the arena's registration booth. Caesar wasn't far behind, eager not to be left out. No sooner had the boys gone than the girls, seeing their brothers rush forward, couldn't stay seated either. They all lined up after them. Suddenly, the stands around us grew quiet. I turned to see Barrett still sitting on the edge of our row, unmoving. "Barrett," I asked, "aren't you going to sign up?" He just shook his head. Barrett shrugged, scanning the half-hearted guards around him. "These guys are too weak to be worth my time," he said. "But that Green Pepper and her generals, now that's a different story. I'd like to see how strong they really are." Across the courtyard stood Qingjiao, nicknamed Green Pepper, flanked by her 4 lieutenants. Though her slender frame trembled slightly, Barrett could still sense a formidable power coiled beneath her exhaustion. Charles met Barrett's gaze with a wry smile. "You want to spar with Green Pepper? Why not? It might be entertaining." Barrett's eyes lit up. At 16, he already stood 5 meters tall, his muscles honed by years of relentless training and battle. Since his duel with the Natural Division's Rear Admiral 2 years ago, he'd found no equal, apart from Charles himself. Without the occasional drill Charles devised to keep him sharp, Barrett admitted he would grow restless from lack of challenge. Qingjiao's breath hitched as she stared at Barrett. The decay of fatigue clung to her, but beneath it, her power simmered, enough to give even Barrett pause. "Very well," she said, steeling herself. "If it's a fight you want, then I won't refuse." Charles stepped back, giving them room. A hush fell over the onlookers, generals and guards alike, eager to witness what promised to be a clash between two of the fleet's most intriguing fighters. Barrett's presence was overwhelming, like an invincible overlord fused with the wrath of Shura's purgatory. In his perfected devil form, his massive frame radiated enough power to rival a general, earning him the strength of the Empire's most formidable vice-emperor. Fully matured, he exuded an authority few could challenge. Qingjiao sat in the auditorium when a sudden chill skittered down her spine. Instinctively, she lifted her head and froze. Charles was staring at her, flanked by Deputy Captain Barrett. Their unblinking gazes felt like the cold stare of death itself. Charles rose and walked toward her with deliberate calm. Each step made her pulse race. He settled into a seat 3 chairs down and leaned forward. "Fancy a bout with my deputy captain?" he asked, his voice deceptively casual. He flicked a glance at the ring on her finger, an unspoken threat shining in the metal. Though it sounded like an offer, the undertone brooked no refusal. In that moment, Qingjiao knew, to decline was to seal her fate. Qing studied the towering young man before him. He knew him instantly, the deputy captain of the Rockefeller Pirates, Douglas Barrett, who'd earned the fearsome title Nation Destroyer at only 12. Rumor called him the Devil's Heir, and he served as Charles's right hand. Qing could only guess at the depths of his power. Barrett's eyes swept over Qing, then slid back to Charles, a cruel smile playing at his lips. Qing turned to Charles and forced himself to speak. "All right," he said. "When do we start?" He had no choice. This challenge had come directly from Charles himself. Charles raised an eyebrow and inclined his head. "Then let's begin the next match." Qing felt his heart tighten, but he managed a nod. He glanced down at the fighting ring. Ever since his 100-match winning streak, he hadn't set foot in the arena for decades. He'd never imagined returning. Biting back his nerves, he rose and made his way down the platform's steps. "Captain?" A ripple of concern passed through the onlookers. "Just wait here. Nothing's going to happen to you." Qing gave them a brief nod and stepped off the stage, bracing himself for what came next. Barrett watched the outcome, then sprang to his feet with a wry smile and strode toward the ring. Inside, Estes had just swept his sword in a powerful arc, sending his opponent crashing to the mat. His eyes flicked to Qingjiao as she climbed the steps, and for an instant his brow tightened until he spotted Barrett following her. With a nod of understanding, he addressed Qingjiao. "Miss Qingjiao, leave this one to me." Barrett met Estes' gaze and grinned. "Very well. Show me what you've got." Estes sheathed his sword with a snap, then dropped lightly into the ring, ready for the match to begin. Chapter 328, Barrett vs. Green Pepper. "Hold on. What's going on? Isn't that—" A ripple of astonishment ran through the arena as the figure in the corner stepped forward. "The Green Pepper commander? He's actually competing? Who's his opponent?" The moment the captain of the Green Pepper crew took his place in the ring, the crowd erupted into excited chatter. Every spectator here knew his reputation well. As the leader of the navy of the 8 treasures in the Flower Kingdom, he occupied one of the highest posts back home. For half a decade, he had led his fleet into the stormy seas of the New World, carving out a fearsome legacy alongside history's most notorious pirates. To the people of the Flower Kingdom, and to sailors across the East Blue, he was a beacon of pride. Even after his climactic defeat at the hands of Carp forced him to withdraw from the New World, his fame remained unshaken. He was still hailed as a living legend. "Who on earth would dare face him?" someone shouted, eyes fixed on the challenger's corner. All gazes swung over to Barrett, standing there as composed as if he were taking a leisurely stroll, not about to do battle with one of the world's most celebrated captains. It had been 4 years since Barrett's own fateful duel that first thrust him into notoriety. Until now, his renown had been confined to the New World and whispered only among select pirate circles. But today, wearing the colors of the Rockefeller Pirates, his mere presence was enough to send a fresh wave of excitement rippling through the stands. Silence fell. The grand clash between the unbowed legend of the Green Pepper crew and the rising force known as Barrett was about to begin, and every soul in the arena held its breath. It was still many miles from the West Sea, so it made sense that no one here would recognize them yet. Barrett threw back his head and laughed, the sound carrying over the restless waves. Ha! Just as I thought, the tides of the past crashing into each other. That kid from long ago is standing right in front of me. Qingjiao's eyes narrowed as she examined Barrett's youthful face. In an instant, she was transported back 5 or 6 years to her first encounter with the Rockefeller pirates, and to the imposing figure she'd seen standing behind Charles, their young captain. "Cut the theatrics, old man," she snapped. "You were arrogant back then, just as you are now." Barrett cracked his knuckles with a sharp snap. A fierce gleam lit his eyes. "Arrogant, am I? You haven't changed either. Let's see whose strength really rules the sea." With that, Qingjiao's gaze flared. A deep blue aura bloomed around her like storm clouds gathering on the horizon, its raw, commanding force surging directly at Barrett. He threw back his head and laughed again, this time with steel in his smile. In the next heartbeat, a ghostly arrogance burst from his form, a wave of ruthless confidence crashing headlong into Qingjiao's advancing presence. Charles settled into his ringside seat, a glass of red wine in hand, and watched the unfolding battle with calm interest. On the mat below, 2 fighters faced off amid roiling currents of spirit energy, one a deep, regal purple, the other a vivid, almost electric green. Each time their auras crackled together, the air seemed to shudder. "What in the world?" someone near the ring murmured, eyes wide. Others around them stared in stunned silence, some even slumping back, overwhelmed by the sheer intensity. Across the arena, Barrett cracked a strange, crooked smile. He dipped into a low stance, then burst forward like a cannonball, barreling straight for his opponent. Qingjiao's brow creased in determination. She raised her right arm, shrouding it in emerald chi, and fixed her gaze on Barrett as he closed the distance. With a sharp exhale, she unleashed her signature 8 strikes fist. A concussive wave rippled outward as her fist drove toward Barrett's face, enough force that the platform rattled beneath them. But Barrett was ready. He twisted aside at the last moment, swinging his own fist straight into the oncoming shockwave. Purple spirit energy flared around his arm, absorbing the impact and cushioning the blow entirely. Charles took a thoughtful sip of wine, intrigued. Neither fighter had yet shown a clear advantage, and in that charged moment, both seemed only to accelerate their assault. The crowd held its breath, waiting to see whose formidable spirit would prevail. "Humph!" Qingjiao snorted, sensing the raw power surging through his right fist. Veins throbbed on his forehead as he unleashed another explosive strike. "Heh!" he growled. A domineering aura flared around both their fists, twisting the very air between them. Though Qingjiao had retreated from the New World, this was no weakened veteran from 30 years hence. Even without his awl head, his physique remained formidable. His ferocity matched Barrett's. Bam! Their blows collided in a thunderous shockwave, pushing each of them back 3 paces. Barrett threw back his head and laughed. "Ha! You really can't underestimate the young blood of today." Qingjiao's expression turned deadly serious. His aura crackled as he clasped his hands together. "Bachong fist! Martial head!" he roared. An aura-enshrouded strike rocketed toward Barrett's skull. Barrett planted his feet, refused to dodge, and unleashed a counterpunch of his own, cloaked in the same oppressive force, aimed squarely at Qingjiao's head. Bang! Another earth-shattering impact echoed through the clearing. A tense silence fell over the makeshift ring as Barrett and Qingjiao squared off. Neither man would give an inch. Finally, Barrett took a measured half-step back, flexing his right hand as a dull numbness pulsed through it. Then, without waiting for Qingjiao's next move, Barrett surged forward like a coiled spring. He unleashed a flurry of heavy punches, each blow landing with a thunderous crack against Qingjiao's guard. Qingjiao's own fists met Barrett's strikes head-on, each man trading raw, primal blows that rattled the boards beneath their feet. The atmosphere crackled with energy as onlookers cheered hoarsely. "Leader, let's go!" Qingjiao's crew cried out. "Keep it up, Deputy Captain," the Rockefeller pirates shouted back, and from Charles's corner came another chorus. "Go, Barrett! Show them what you've got!" Barrett paused for a second, a confident smile flickering across his face as he retightened his fists. His reputation aboard the Rockefeller pirates was second only to Captain Charles himself, loved by the crew for his even temper and fair spirit, and never one to pick a needless fight. Now, Fueled by their cheers, Barrett readied himself for the next exchange, every ounce of his strength poised to break the stalemate. The pirates' treatment under Charles's command was always fair and just, which is why his crew respected him and his captaincy remained so popular. Today, he stood in the center of the arena, facing off against Qingjiao. The duel had already stretched for an hour, each combatant matching the other blow for blow. "You little," Qingjiao snarled, frustration breaking through her usual composure. No matter how hard she pressed the attack, Charles simply parried and countered, guiding her every move into his favor. "Damn it," she spat. "If my horn hadn't been shattered, do you think a brat like you could hold your own?" Half of Qingjiao's power came from that horn, which Carp had flattened moments before, leaving her severely weakened. "Get down here, Green Pepper!" Qingjiao cried out to her second-in-command, Barrett. But Barrett never arrived in time. With sudden force, he swung a crushing fist straight at Qingjiao's face. She saw it coming, but by the time she registered the warning, the impact had already landed. Boom! The arena floor buckled beneath them as Qingjiao's body flew backward. Dust and debris rained down, cracks spidering out from the point of impact. "Leader!" her crew shouted in horror from the arena's edge. "Qingjiao's been beaten. Who is this kid?" From the stands, the spectators burst into excited chatter. All eyes were fixed on the boy who had just felled the legendary Green Pepper. Seated high above them, Charles allowed himself a slow, triumphant grin. He rose slightly in his chair and laughed, rich, victorious, and utterly confident. "Ha! Green Pepper defeated," he called down, voice carrying clearly through the hushed arena. "Is there anyone else who wants to try me?" "You're getting old," Barrett taunted, glaring down at the scattered green peppers on the ground. Defeated again. Qingjiao barely registered his jab. She slumped to the dirt, her eyes vacant and her mind blank. Chapter 329, Everything Carried by Caesar. The arena fell into stunned silence the moment the duel ended. Few had believed the invincible leader of the Qingjiao faction could be overthrown. Yet here she lay, defeated by an unknown challenger. Whispers of disbelief rippled through the crowd as Qingjiao's own generals stared at Barrett in slack-jawed shock. Barrett simply lifted her chin, a triumphant smile playing on her lips. Across the ring, Qingjiao's proud bearing crumpled. Slowly, she bowed her head, and a heavy aura of defeat settled around her. Barrett's smile flickered into a slight frown. This victory had come far too easily. She had expected a true test of her growing power, not a swift, one-sided affair. Without another glance at her fallen opponent, Barrett turned on her heel and strode out of the arena. From the sidelines, Charles watched her departure with quiet satisfaction. Since bringing Barrett into the New World in 1484 of the Haiyuan calendar, he'd guided her growth step by step. Each victory, each hardship had sharpened her skills and her resolve. Now, even Qingjiao, a veteran of 5 or 6 years in this world, could no longer stand in her way. Barrett was closing the gap between them faster than Charles had ever anticipated. A voice cut through his thoughts. "Captain!" Barrett emerged from the corridor, her eyes bright with excitement. She hurried toward Charles, pride and relief shining in her expression. Charles met her gaze and allowed himself a pleased smile. This was exactly the moment he'd been waiting for. Charles nodded thoughtfully. "Exactly. You're only getting stronger, already fighting at the level of a junior admiral. Give it 5 years and you'll be on my heels. By then, the Rockefeller pirates will dominate every corner of the seas." Barrett's eyes burned with loyalty. "For the Rockefeller pirates, I'd gladly lay down my life." Charles gave him a firm pat on the shoulder. "That's the spirit." He swept his gaze over the shattered fighting ring. Their clash with Qingjiao had obliterated the platform. There was no way any more matches could go on here. Down in the stands, the crew, those mischievous little devils, slid back toward the exit, faces twisted in annoyance. Robert, one of the deckhands, stomped up beside Charles and let out a dramatic sigh. All this fuss for a single bout, and look at this dump of an arena. How do they even keep the place running? He jabbed a finger at the broken ring. "I was just starting to have fun, and before I knew it, it was over." Charles cracked a smile. "Don't worry, we'll get a proper rematch soon enough." He glanced at Barrett and added, "Next time, we'll make sure the arena survives. Once we get back to Kame Island, we'll build a proper arena and invite every top fighter in this new world to compete. Charles Rockefeller smiled at his son's fervor. He had no intention of stepping into the ring himself, but he fully supported Robert's fighting spirit. Really? Robert nearly jumped out of his seat, eyes shining with excitement. Beside him, Deidara turned to their father with equal enthusiasm. The two boys shared the same relentless drive, so different from their older brother's laid-back nature. Absolutely, Charles replied, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. I still remember the makeshift ring I threw together here before. It's time to remodel it into something worthy of Kame Island. Plus, it'll bring in a steady income, 2 birds with 1 stone. That's amazing, Robert exclaimed. By then, I'll rack up an unbeatable winning streak and let everyone know me as Robert Rockefeller. Count me in, too. Deidara Rockefeller will reign supreme, Deidara declared, puffing out his chest proudly. Charles laughed, pride warming his voice. That's the fighting spirit I love to see. You two Rockefellers are destined for greatness. Although their talents weren't top tier, their fighting spirit was undeniable, and Charles was certain they'd become the family's premier combatants in time. His praise sent Robert and Deidara beaming with pride. But in them, Caesar's gaze clouded with disappointment. Estes, standing at Caesar's side, gave his shoulder a reassuring squeeze. Come on, she urged gently. Buoyed by his sister's encouragement, Caesar managed a small smile. The arena lay in ruins, so rather than linger, Charles and the others had chosen to explore the city. This time, though, they moved in pairs. Caesar fell into step beside Estes as they wandered down a bustling street. After a few moments of silence, Caesar glanced at Estes with worry in his eyes. Estes, did I let you down back there? Estes looked at him coolly. Why would you think that? Caesar's shoulders slumped. No matter what I do, Father never really praises me. He just nods, like he's disappointed I didn't do better. Estes studied him for a heartbeat, then softened. Don't be so hard on yourself. You're the eldest son and heir of the Rockefeller family. Father's expectations are higher for you than for any of us. He wants to see you strong, not coddled. In our world, strength earns respect. She smiled. You'll prove yourself, Caesar. I know it. Father did nothing wrong, Estes declared, his voice steady as he locked eyes with Caesar. At Estes' solemn pronouncement, Caesar met his brother's gaze for a moment, then bowed his head in silent acknowledgement. I understand, he finally said, sounding as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Yet the responsibilities he carried would not allow him to rest easy. Their first truly honest conversation ended there. Though Caesar found a new purpose amid his confusion, it felt unbearably heavy. Sensing this, Estes gently patted Caesar on the shoulder. Don't be too hard on yourself. Just fulfill the duties Father has set for you, one step at a time. Okay, Caesar replied, giving a determined nod. With that, he wandered off into the early evening, his thoughts as heavy as ever. By nightfall, he returned to the family estate, where Charles was already awaiting an important visitor. Mr. Rockefeller, a servant announced, bowing courteously as he presented an ornate scroll. This letter has just arrived from His Majesty the Emperor. He requests the honor of your presence at tonight's banquet. Chapter 330, The Emperor's Invitation. A cool, refined voice drifted through the courtyard just as Charles stepped inside the gates. He glanced up to see a slender figure holding out a pale, crisply folded parchment. Mr. Charles Rockefeller, the eunuch said with quiet formality, welcome to the Kingdom of Flowers. By order of His Majesty the Emperor, I am honored to invite you and your family to a royal banquet at the palace this evening. Please grant us the privilege of your presence, handwritten by the Emperor himself. The delicate calligraphy left no doubt that the invitation was genuine. Charles smiled and accepted the parchment. Thank you. I won't keep His Majesty waiting. Shall we go now? The eunuch's eyes brightened. At your earliest convenience, sir. The imperial court awaits you. Charles turned to his chief steward. Barrett, fetch the children and bring everyone back right away. We're hosting a banquet this evening to celebrate. Tell the crew they're free for the night. Very good, sir. Barrett saluted crisply and hurried off. Charles tucked the Emperor's invitation into his coat and glanced skyward. Tonight, the Kingdom of Flowers would open its palace gates, and he intended to make a memorable entrance. I'll make the arrangements immediately. With that, Barrett turned on his heel and strode from the hall. "Your Grace, we will depart shortly." Charles offered the eunuch a polite smile. In both his past and present lives, he had never once laid eyes on a palace eunuch, and the novelty of the sight left him momentarily fascinated. Sensing Charles's curious gaze, Barrett felt a shiver run down his spine. From the look of this pirate chieftain, did he have some unusual tastes? Barrett couldn't help but chastise the stranger in his mind. He knew only that the Emperor had commanded him to handle this pirate with great courtesy, a sign that the man's reputation far exceeded that of an ordinary sea rover. If His Majesty's orders had been any less insistent, Barrett suspected he would already have been dismissed from court service for the impertinent stare his guest was giving him. Chapter 7. Invitation to the Palace. "Since you love watching eunuchs so much," Charles muttered to himself with a smirk, "I might as well make you one." Elena shook her head firmly, cradling their 2-year-old son. 2 other maidens stood beside her, each holding one of the twins. "Charles, we're not coming," she insisted. "You take the children. We need to stay behind to keep an eye on them. If we all go, they'll be up to mischief again." Charles glanced at the little boys squirming in their mother's arms, then at Klein and Caesar waiting nearby. He hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "All right, be careful. If anything happens, send a message right away." He tucked a stray lock of hair behind Elena's ear. "Don't worry, I'll manage." As Elena led the children away, glancing back anxiously, Charles squared his shoulders. Caesar and the other guards flanked him as he followed the eunuch appointed by the Emperor. Together, they made their way toward the palace gates. Inside the opulent courtyard, preparations for tonight's banquet were already underway. Servants bustled about with trays of exotic fruits and elaborately spiced meats. Lanterns were being strung from marble pillars, and the scent of jasmine wafted through the air. Before they could reach the throne hall, a young minister hurried forward, his robes flapping. Bowing deeply, he whispered so only Charles and the eunuch could hear, "Your Majesty, pardon my presumption, but inviting a notorious pirate into the palace. Isn't it too risky? If anything goes wrong, the entire court would pay dearly." The eunuch's eyes flicked nervously from the minister to Charles. For a moment, tension crackled in the warm evening air. Charles caught the eunuch's sleeve and leaned closer. "He's not here to raid the kingdom," he said quietly. "He answered my summons in good faith. Trust me, by tonight's end, you'll know he's an ally, not a threat." Just then, the Ace doors swung open. A hush fell over the courtyard as the Emperor emerged, resplendent in embroidered silk. He surveyed the guests with calm authority, then motioned for Charles to join him at the head of the long banquet table. As Charles stepped forward, the minister fell silent, and even the nervous eunuch straightened his back. Lantern light danced across polished marble, illuminating every expectant face. Tonight, in the heart of the Kingdom of Flowers, a pirate would dine with royalty, and the course of history might shift forever. "I've also made inquiries about the Rockefeller pirates through every channel," Lord Ching reported to the Emperor. "They're not the vicious sort. By all accounts, they're quite reasonable." Emperor Ren paused in his pacing, eyes fixed on the assembled ministers. "That may be," he admitted, "but I remain uneasy. If Charles Rockefeller decides to strike, none of us could stop him. You know that just this afternoon, his deputy captain, Barrett, bested the commander of the Green Pepper Legion. A single deputy captain with that sort of strength. Imagine what Charles himself is capable of." The Prime Minister let out a sharp snort of concern. At the same moment, Lord Ching's lips curled into a cold sneer at the very notion of Rockefeller might. Realizing the tension he'd stoked, the Prime Minister bowed hastily. "Forgive me, Lord Ching. That was an ill-considered remark." Turning back to the Emperor, the Prime Minister straightened his robes and spoke with renewed confidence. "Your Majesty, rest assured that if Charles Rockefeller truly makes a move against us, I will personally see to it that he does not succeed." Lord Ching inclined his head in respectful agreement. "We will stand ready, Your Majesty, to defend the realm against any threat. With Qingjiao at my side, I have nothing to fear," the Emperor proclaimed. He still held Qingjiao in the highest regard. Although a vice-captain had bested him in their afternoon sparring match, the Emperor readily acknowledged Qingjiao's skill. At the Emperor's words, the Prime Minister fell silent. Soon after, Charles Rockefeller arrived at the palace gates. He paused, eyes wide, taking in the soaring marble columns and vast courtyards. "This place is incredible," he breathed. "It's even grander than my own castle." Surveying every detail of the sprawling complex, Charles turned to his father with a soft sigh. "Dad, when we go home, we should build a palace like this. Then you can be an emperor, too." Robert Rockefeller stood proudly behind his son, a warm smile tugging at his lips. At that moment, the eunuch who had led them nearly stumbled on the threshold. Steadying himself, he bowed low to Robert. "Your Highness, Lord Charles's filial devotion is truly exemplary." Charles flushed, at a loss for words, while Robert exchanged a congratulatory glance with Daedala, pride shining in his eyes. Charles stood before the palace gates, studying Chief Eunuch Robert's guarded expression. With a light smile, he said, "They're only children. Don't mind their chatter." Robert's frown eased, and Charles pressed on. "But you, sir, are truly exceptional, a dragon and phoenix combined. Your prospects must be boundless." As the emperor's closest advisor, the eunuch had grown accustomed to flattery, yet Charles's praise rang so genuine that even the boys clustered at the gate swelled with pride. "Uncle Robert, you really have an eye for talent," one of them gushed. "I've never met anyone like him." Robert chuckled softly. For a fleeting moment, he toyed with the idea of taking these eager youngsters under his wing, but a thought of their father quickly sent that notion packing. "Please, come inside," he said, sweeping his hand toward the open gate. At his signal, the great doors creaked open, and Charles followed him into the palace courtyard. No sooner had they crossed the threshold than Robert strode to a waiting attendant. In a clear, commanding tone, he announced, "Your Majesty, Lord Charles Rockefeller has arrived." A palace messenger hurried out of the fateful throne room. "Quickly, fetch the Prime Minister to extend our guest a proper welcome." "Right away, Your Majesty," came the reply. Moments later, the Prime Minister himself emerged, bowing deeply. "Your Majesty." "Veteran, go and take a look," Empress Qingzhao said, rising gracefully. At the Emperor's nod, the veteran bowed and, accompanied by Qingzhao, stepped outside the main hall. They soon spotted a delegation making its way toward them. "Mr. Rockefeller, His Majesty awaits you in the hall. Welcome. Please, allow us to honor you." "The banquet is ready," the Prime Minister proclaimed with a courteous smile. Charles Rockefeller offered a genial return smile as he and his companions were led inside. The Prime Minister's hospitality was warm, but Charles had learned to respond with careful politeness, never letting his guard down. The massive double doors swung open to reveal the main hall's breathtaking splendor. Polished marble floors gleamed beneath crystal chandeliers, and banners bearing the imperial insignia hung between carved pillars. At the far end, seated upon an ornately carved throne, was the emperor himself, a dignified, middle-aged man clad in a golden dragon robe, his expression both majestic and measured. Charles paused at the entrance, taking in the scene, steeling himself for the evening ahead. Chapter 331. The great hall of the Flower Kingdom fell into respectful silence as the emperor, clad in silken robes embroidered with blossoms, rose from his throne. "Welcome, honored guests, to the Kingdom of Flowers." His voice resonated through the chamber, both commanding and gracious. Charles lifted his head and met the emperor's gaze. Each evaluated the other in a single electrifying moment. The sovereign eager to behold the world's most notorious pirate, and the pirate curious to see the legendary ruler of these fabled lands. Around them, courtiers stiffened, and even the royal interpreter, known by the curious name Green Pepper, felt a tremor of anticipation. Determined to break the tension, Charles stepped forward with measured grace and offered a low bow. "Your Majesty," he said, voice steady, "I am deeply honored by your invitation. Thank you for your warm welcome." A broad smile spread across the emperor's face, smrathing, and his hearty laughter echoed through the hall. "Ha ha ha! There's no need for such formalities, Mr. Charles. I realize my summons was sudden. I had only just decided to meet you in person. I hope you'll forgive the lack of preparations." Charles inclined his head once more, maintaining eye contact. Though the audience watched with bated breath, the ice between sovereign and pirate had begun to thaw, and thus, in the heart of the Flower Kingdom, an extraordinary meeting commenced. Charles stepped into the grand hall, flanked by a handful of nervous dukes and ministers hastily summoned to bear witness. The vaulted ceiling echoed with the murmur of courtiers lining the galleries. "Your Majesty," he replied without a hint of deference in his voice. "Why all this fuss over a mere pirate? You know full well I never sought the title. Yet here you are, inviting me to dine alongside kings and princes, hardly a reason for me to complain." The Emperor settled onto his gilded throne, his expression warm. "Pirate, Charles? Hardly. Your so-called pirate king moniker was born of circumstance. Pressed into service by the Navy, you saved countless ships and lives. That, to me, is the mark of a true hero. I have long admired heroes, and tonight I welcome you as my honored friend." For a moment, Charles felt his composure waver. He had attended royal banquets before, but never had an emperor so lavishly extolled his deeds. He cleared his throat and forced a grin. "I am humbled, Your Majesty. Please," the Emperor gestured toward a low dais to his right. "Take your seat. The feast is about to begin." A pair of attendants guided Charles to a velvet-cushioned chair beside the Emperor. As they settled, the grand doors at the far end of the hall swung open. Musicians struck up a lilting melody, and a procession of dancers drifted in. Gossamer gowns in pastel hues swirled around them as they sang, a chorus of crystal voices carrying notes like drifting petals. Charles watched them for a moment, the tension in his shoulders easing. In this gilded court, amid applause and song, he was no longer pirate or outcast. Tonight, he was a hero welcomed at last. Charles settled into the festivities almost at once, raising a toast with the Emperor himself. He still wondered why he'd been summoned so abruptly, but the feast before him left no room for complaint. The tables groaned under platters of roasted meats, fresh breads, and jewel-bright desserts. His 4 young charges, Estes, Barrett, Robert, and Daedala, were equally captivated. Estes and Barrett sat silently, faces polite but distant, their stiff posture betraying their discomfort in the imperial court. In contrast, Robert and Daedala were having the time of their lives. Laughter bubbled from their mouths as they sampled new delicacies and watched dancers whirl beneath golden lanterns. At one point, Daedala leaned toward the timid crown prince seated next to her. "You're the future ruler of this kingdom," she whispered, big eyes wide with wonder. "Doesn't that make all of this yours, too?" The prince's cheeks burned scarlet. He shifted in his seat, at a loss for words. Before he could respond, Robert shot an admonishing look at his sister and clamped a hand over her mouth. "Knock it off, Daedala," he muttered, though a grin tugged at his lips. Embarrassed but amused, the prince offered a small nod and a shy smile. Around them, court nobles chatted over goblets of wine and passed delicacies from hand to hand. The merriment continued long past midnight, finally petering out only when the sky outside turned pale with the first light of dawn. When the last candle guttered out, Charles rose and guided his sleepy troop toward the palace gates. He scooped up Robert, who was already drifting in and out of sleep, and gently shook his shoulder. "One more drink?" Robert mumbled, waving weakly at a passing steward. Charles chuckled and ruffled the boy's hair. "All right, one last cup, and then we're all going to bed." So, with rosy cheeks and giggles, the little group lingered in the courtyard, savoring the final moments of their unforgettable night. Charles felt the world tilt as Daedara slumped against his shoulder, drool trickling from the corner of his mouth. Esdeath barked an order. "Look at them. They're underage. How could you even let them drink?" Charles shifted his weight, bracing himself under the wobbly forms of the 2 younger kids. Barrett, standing beside him, held Caesar in his arms. The boy was fast asleep, muttering in his dreams, "Dad, I'm sorry. I'll never do it again." Charles's face darkened at the sound of Caesar's incoherent apologies. He took charge and started them all back down the moonlit path. It wasn't only the 3 in Barrett's arms who were drunk. Tesla and Logan were nodding off too, though they did their best to keep pace. "Ugh, Mom's going to kill me when we get home," Logan groaned, half asleep. Charles shot him a warning glance. Immediately, Tesla and the others stiffened, their drunken haze vanishing in an instant. All 6 of them turned expectantly to Estes, their eldest sister, as if she alone could save them from the coming scolding. Estes stared at her younger siblings, stunned by their audacity. She never would have guessed they'd actually drunk anything stronger than tea. Then it dawned on her. Robert and Daedara must have spiked their cups while no one was looking. She let out a long sigh. All right, everyone, she said, rubbing her temples. Let's get you sober and figure out what those two scoundrels put in your drinks. Esdeath's parting quip still rang in their ears as they slipped out into the night. Not even Caesar would dare, she teased. You're courting disaster, and I can't save you from what comes next. With that, Estes scooped up a nearly asleep Julie and fell in beside her. It was close to 1 o'clock in the morning, and the group of 5- and 6-year-olds were nodding off on their feet. Esdeath's words had drained all color from their faces. Each child was bracing for the scolding that awaited once they reached home. Charles winced with guilt. He'd promised to keep an eye on them, but the moment he'd spotted the Emperor propped up at a wine-stained table, he'd abandoned all caution, downed cup after cup, and ended up swapping jokes and toasts like an old friend. Meanwhile, nobody noticed the children slipping away. He fully expected to be banished to the empty guest chambers for several days. Entirely his own fault. Shaking himself out of his regrets, Charles hoisted 2 of the littlest onto his shoulders, one perched on each, and decided it was high time the children learned a bit of family discipline. Slinging their small bodies carefully, he set off down the deserted lamp-lit street. As they trudged along, Charles couldn't help muttering. He'd just crossed paths with the Emperor's older brother, who'd brusquely informed them they couldn't linger at the palace after hours. No hospitality there at all, Charles complained under his breath. Still, he wasn't about to fuss over his own reputation for late-night revelry. Rumors were the least of his worries when he had half-asleep rascals to shepherd safely home. Charles had insisted they leave the palace at once. Staying on the Emperor's grounds any longer would only invite gossip, too many curious eyes, too much speculation. So they returned to their temporary lodging, hoping for a quiet night. Luckily, by the time they arrived, Elena and the others were already fast asleep. Charles himself, exhausted by the day's chaos, scarcely registered the unfamiliar room before he drifted off. But dawn brought no peace. A sudden crash of wood on stone, bang, shattered the silence, followed by frantic hammering, ping-pong-pong. Beneath it all, someone sobbed. Charles jolted awake and stumbled into the corridor. "What's happening?" he demanded, peering through the dim dawn light. Ahead, the guard known as the East Lion was shouting at the top of his lungs. "Charles, how could you guarantee this?" His roar echoed off the walls. It clicked, and Charles's heart sank. The fiasco from yesterday flooded back. Oh no! He turned to flee, but before he could take a step, a giant translucent sphere enveloped him, trapping him in mid-motion. Damn it! They'd found a way to stop him. From deeper in the hallway came Elena's furious roar. "You idiot! Why did you let them drink?" Irina's cold snarl followed. Cornered, Charles drew a shaky breath. He had to think fast and explain himself before the bubble tightened any further. Charles had no chance to explain. The cacophony around him was overwhelming. A child's piercing cries and the roar of the Eastern Lion had already made his early morning misery complete. Chapter 332, Martial Arts in the Kingdom of Flowers. I spent the entire morning training under Elena's watchful eye. I couldn't blame anyone but myself. After all, I was supposed to look after the children, and I clearly hadn't planned well enough. When Elena finally wrapped up her lesson and the chatter of her young students faded away, I surveyed the now quiet training room and let out a long sigh. The lion's roar, technique from the Eastern River, was every bit as formidable as its name suggested. My muscles burned, and every joint felt as if it had been tempered in steel. Next time, I vowed inwardly, I'll keep my focus. I pulled on my coat, carefully shaped my signature mustache, and tipped on my top hat. Grasping my polished walking cane, I stepped out onto the bustling city street. My destination was the fabled Kingdom of Flowers, but first, a bit of local reconnaissance. All around me, street criers hawked their messages. Now recruiting apprentices. Master Tan is opening his doors today. South Main Street, Master Yi seeks new disciples. Don't miss it. Master Zhang's showdown with the Shaolin monks happens this very afternoon. The crowds were surging toward a single square, their excitement palpable. A public duel against the Shaolin monks? That was an event I couldn't possibly pass up. With renewed interest, I joined the throng, eager to see what awaited in this land of flowers and its celebrated martial arts. Charles had always been fascinated by tales of the country of flowers. its hidden temples, secret societies, and legendary warriors. Determined to learn more, he followed a swelling crowd through the winding streets until he arrived at a lively square in the heart of the city. At its center stood a makeshift wooden platform. Upon it, a white-haired man with a ruddy beard faced the throng, flanked by 7 youthful attendants. "Xuanzi," the old man bellowed, voice ringing out over the murmurs. "Today I, Zhang Sanfeng, declare this spot the founding site of my own martial arts school. Whether you welcome it or not, it's happening." A young monk in crimson robes stepped forward, indignation flashing in his eyes. "Zhang Sanfeng, you traitor! You abandoned your master and spurned the Shaolin order. How dare you tarnish their name? Have you forgotten where you first learned the way of the fist?" Zhang Sanfeng's lips curved into a defiant grin. "I am no longer a Shaolin disciple. My path is my own. And don't credit my style to Shaolin. It was forged through my own trials. Today I plant my banner on this ground. If any of you dare to oppose me, come fight me here and now." A heavy silence fell over the square as the crowd exchanged uneasy glances. They knew of Zhang Sanfeng's past, a once honored student of Shaolin who now renounced his lineage. Then, from the back of the assembled onlookers, a single voice rose. "We accept. Let the contest begin." At that challenge, the square erupted in cheering, and Charles felt his pulse quicken. The first clash of steel and spirit was about to begin, and he would witness it all firsthand. Charles stood among the crowd as they thundered their approval. "Fight!" they roared. On the raised platform, the old monk flinched, pain flickering across his face, then squared his shoulders, eyes narrowing. "How intriguing," he murmured. Charles took in the 2 fighters. On one side, a scruffy old man. On the other, the sad-faced monk. He could clearly feel their auras, each as potent as the famed Qingjiao's. His curiosity about the flower country burned brighter. "Since my benefactor insists," the monk Xuanzi said politely, "I cannot refuse." Zhang Sanfeng chuckled, brushing dust from his worn robes. "You should have spoken sooner, Xuanzi. Very well, watch closely." In an instant, Zhang Sanfeng's fist shot forward. Though his stance looked unassuming, the speed was breathtaking. "He's unleashed it! Zhang Sanfeng's signature, Tai Chi Fist!" the spectators yelled, recognizing the graceful, flowing form that had been his hallmark for decades. No one could withstand all 3 moves in his repertoire. "That Tai Chi strike, truly a marvel," someone whispered in admiration. From the sidelines, Charles narrowed his eyes and offered a slight nod. The fluid mastery on display confirmed that this fight would be one to remember. The intensity of his chi and blood energy soared like the heavens, and every motion radiated the poise of a true master. He'd already advanced to near general level. No wonder the Western Sea's mightiest nation commanded such awe. Their power was so fearsome that even the world government dared not challenge them. "Look, Abbot Xuanzi has struck. It's his great Vajra palm." A massive, thunderous palm thrust met Zhang Sanfeng's relaxed fist. At first glance, it seemed unstoppable, yet when they collided, it was like flinging a drenched cow into the ocean. Nothing happened. One by one, Zhang Sanfeng neutralized the shock waves, bleeding the abbot of his force. Impressive, Charles thought, his heart beating faster. Abbot Xuanzi's great Vajra palm blocked so easily. All around, spectators had expected the venerable Shaolin abbot to dominate, but he'd landed no decisive blow. It looked more like 2 children shoving each other in a playground. "This abbot's strength is underwhelming," someone muttered. "Silence," another voice snapped. "You don't understand. Both fighters have reached the transformation stage. There's a profound essence in every strike." "Don't talk nonsense if you don't understand," one of the elders snapped at a curious onlooker. The others nodded eagerly. "Exactly. Our abbot was a legend across the West Sea in his youth. Have you ever heard of Admiral Warring States? He trained under the abbot, and look how far he's come." The crowd beamed with pride as the abbot accepted their praise with quiet grace. At the edge of the throng stood Charles, casually munching on a melon. He found it entertaining how every tale of the Warring States hero somehow circled back to this afternoon's exhibition. On the raised platform before them, 2 martial artists moved in measured strikes and feints. Officially, it was a friendly duel, meant to inaugurate a new dojo and recruit disciples, but their techniques were surprisingly basic, scarcely more advanced than the Bachong fist taught in the village. Suddenly, A voice cut through the murmur. "The match is almost over." Everyone turned toward the announcement. "Look, Master Tan is stepping up," a boy whispered. Charles shifted his gaze to the platform. There, poised and calm, stood Master Tan. His calves bulged like coiled springs, evidence of years spent perfecting his rare, devastating kicking style. The real contest was about to begin. Charles watched in fascination as the last combatant stepped forward. Although the faint aura emanating from the old monk was weaker than the two champions before him, it still exuded formidable power. Charles couldn't help blurting out, "So this really is Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon?" His curiosity piqued. Martial arts in the Land of Flowers far exceeded anything he'd imagined. Impulsively, he shouted, "Old monk, come down!" Before anyone could react, Zhang Sanfeng moved with uncanny speed. He struck out once, and the venerable Abbot Xuanzi was sent hurtling off the elevated platform. With a heavy thud, Xuanzi crashed onto the ground, coughing violently. A crimson arc spattered as he spat out a mouthful of blood. "Abbot!" the surrounding Shaolin monks cried, rushing to cradle their fallen master. "Quick, form the Arhat formation." But a senior monk raised his hand and called out, "Enough!" At his command, the others halted. Supported by two attendants, Xuanzi glared up at Zhang Sanfeng, who stood alone on the stage, an amused smile playing across his lips. Zhang Sanfeng bowed low in mock courtesy. "Revered Abbot, your skills are indeed extraordinary, but they are no match for mine. Shaolin concedes defeat today. On my part, I intend to establish a martial arts school here and take disciples. I trust Shaolin has no objection?" Xuanzi's lips curled in anger, but he offered no rebuttal. With a snort, he signaled his monks to withdraw, and they bore him off the field. At that, Zhang Sanfeng threw back his head and laughed, a clear, ringing sound that carried across the courtyard. "Who's next? Who dares to stop me from opening my school? Step forward and challenge me." Charles stood among the onlookers, awestruck. A murmur rippled through the crowd, one voice whispering, "Zhang Sanfeng has truly lost his mind." Yet no one moved to oppose him. Zhang Sanfeng's laughter, bold and unrestrained, echoed long after the monks had departed. "Don't be ridiculous. Let me step up and give it a try." A middle-aged man in a short coat climbed onto the platform. He settled into a low, poised stance, right hand extended toward Zhang Sanfeng. A voice rang out from the crowd. "That's Dong Haichuan, founder of the Bagua sect. May I request your instruction, Master Wing Chun Yewen?" Almost on cue, another middle-aged figure in a simple gown appeared. He swept his robe aside and fixed Zhang Sanfeng with an eager gaze. "And I'm Tan Daoliang. Kindly enlighten me as well." Behind him, the earlier speaker, Master Tan, stepped forward too. Confronted by three challengers in rapid succession, Zhang Sanfeng threw back his head and laughed heartily. "All of you at once? Very well. This old man is ready to take on 10. Chapter 333, Charles's Body Technique. A sudden hush fell over the courtyard as Zhang Sanfeng's voice rang out. "Who dares to challenge me next?" Three eager disciples, each itching to prove himself, snarled in response. Without hesitation, they surged forward from different directions, unleashing their signature strikes at the venerable Wing Chun master. The onlookers leaned in, bracing for impact. Yet Zhang Sanfeng did not flinch. He met each attack squarely. Three muffled thuds echoed in rapid succession, and one by one, the three assailants were hurled backward, skidding across the ground before they could even mount a follow-up move. "Who else?" Zhang Sanfeng called, sweeping his robe aside in a grand gesture that sent ripples through the crowd. A figure staggered to his feet at the edge of the arena, Ye Wen clutching his chest. He forced a defiant grin and staggered forward. "Wing Chun may be refined," he panted, "but it's a pity your execution is lacking." Zhang Sanfeng offered him a calm nod of acknowledgement. Then, with a single, precise motion, he struck. Ye Wen's eyes widened in shock, his strength evaporating as if the wind had been knocked out of him. He crumpled to the earth, unconscious before he hit the ground. "Master Ye!" his fellow disciples cried, rushing to support him. "Help him up, quick!" From the sidelines, Charles watched every moment, heart pounding with excitement. He glanced back at the fallen challengers, then lifted his gaze to Zhang Sanfeng, still standing tall and composed on the platform. A spark ignited in Charles's eyes. With measured footsteps, he slipped through the throng of onlookers and, in a single fluid motion, vaulted onto the stage. ready at last to test his own body technique against the legendary master. The grand pavilion of the Kingdom of Flowers thrummed with excitement. Spectators in vibrant silks pressed closer, eager to witness the next exhibition of martial prowess. At that moment, a lone figure in unfamiliar West Sea attire strode into the center ring. His robe bore the swirling motifs of ocean waves and soaring cranes, patterns no one here had seen before. He paused, bowed deeply, and called out in a clear, confident voice, "Outsider, here to seek your counsel." A hush fell over the crowd. Zhang Sanfeng, the kingdom's greatest martial artist, narrowed his eyes. "An outsider?" he echoed, his tone cool but edged with curiosity. Murmurs rippled through the onlookers. At last, a warrior from beyond the western seas had arrived. A bark of laughter cut through the tension. "A West Sea visitor?" one courtier jeered. "Have you gone mad? This is the Kingdom of Flowers." Zhang Sanfeng said nothing at first. He simply studied the newcomer as if weighing his spirit. Finally he spoke. "Explain yourself." The visitor straightened, meeting the master's gaze without a flicker of doubt. "I come to challenge the greatest martial artist of the Kingdom of Flowers," he declared. "Your reputation stretches across the West Sea, and I wish to test my skill against yours." A ripple of outrage surged through the crowd. "Such arrogance," someone spat. "Dare to challenge our champion? You must be ignorant, or insane." Unfazed by the jeers, the newcomer, Charles of the West Sea, bowed once more, eyes steady. He made no excuses, offered no apologies. With a subtle shift of his stance, he indicated he was ready, fists clenched, feet rooted. All eyes turned to Zhang Sanfeng, who now stood silent, gauging this unexpected challenger. In the charged stillness that followed, it was clear. The Kingdom of Flowers was about to witness a duel unlike any before it. For years, Charles had dedicated himself to the sword, nearly forgetting the body arts he'd first learned. In his previous life as a mercenary, he'd spent months in a brutal training camp, mastering every major boxing style, plus bits of military boxing, Muay Thai, Judo, Jiu-Jitsu, and other lethal techniques. When he set out on his journey, he had simply followed that mental curriculum, drilling himself relentlessly. Now, across the clearing, Zhang Sanfeng studied the young fighter before him. In Charles's eyes burned an unbridled eagerness, a fanatic's fervor. Zhang folded his arms at his chest, bracing himself, while Charles offered a slight, knowing smile and silently accepted the challenge. In an instant, Charles's whole aura shifted. A feral energy flared around him as he exploded into motion. First, a savage right cross aimed at Zhang's jaw. Zhang twisted his head aside, just barely deflecting the blow. Before he could recover, Charles drove a knee into Zhang's ribs, the force knocking the older man off balance. Instinctively, Zhang Sanfeng raised his arms to shield his torso, but the impact still forced him to stagger backward, winded and blinking in surprise. Charles didn't pause for breath. His elbow smashed toward Master Zhang Sanfeng's temple. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. What a brutal strike. Zhang Sanfeng's hand snapped into a knife hand block, the edge of his palm driving into Charles's bicep with a sickening crack. Charles grunted, pain flaring, but he twisted free and landed another step back, eyes blazing. Master Zhang rubbed his wrist in surprise. This boy's strength was unlike anything he'd ever felt. "Come on!" Charles taunted, pressing the attack without mercy. Before Zhang could steady himself, Charles lunged again, this time delivering a piercing kick at Zhang's ribs. Zhang's pupils contracted. He thrust up both arms to shield his torso, but Charles's foot still connected with bone-jarring force. With a heavy thud, Zhang Sanfeng stumbled back 3 steps, clutching his side. His face paling, he glared at Charles through gritted teeth. "Enough! Stop this! At once!" he panted, each breath stabbing him with pain. "Your power, it's like steel." Fighting him was like striking solid steel. Charles threw up his hands in exasperation and incredulity. "Enough! Stop already! My old bones can't take much more." Zhang Sanfeng only laughed. "Old man, you were the one who called off the fight, remember? Fine. If I'm not allowed to hold back, then I'll give you everything I've got." Without another word, he sprang forward and lashed out with a straight punch. "Insolent brat, nobody ever taught you to respect your elders?" Charles barely managed to bring up his forearms in time. The impact rattled his arms, and he caught sight of a dark, rippling aura enveloping Zhang Sanfeng's fist, an ominous sign of some external power at work. Had he taken that blow square on, he'd have been crushed. A murmur ran through the spectators. "This is supposed to be a fair martial arts match. No forbidden tricks," someone hissed, as all eyes fixed on the two fighters. The crowd's taunts rang out. "Still waving those swords? The old master doesn't even flinch." Zhang Sanfeng ground his teeth, itching to leap from the platform, palm strike at the ready, just to silence their smug faces. If they truly believed they could do better, let them step forward and face Charles. But Charles said nothing. He simply redoubled his assault, fists, elbows, knees, and feet striking in rapid succession, each blow sharpening his skill and lightening the weight on his spirit. With every impact, his excitement grew. Under that relentless barrage, Zhang Sanfeng reeled. Charles's punches came so quickly they blurred. The veteran master couldn't even raise his head to defend. For a full 10 minutes, Charles pressed the attack without the slightest pause. At last, Zhang Sanfeng's guard collapsed. His reactions lagged by a heartbeat just as a massive fist materialized inches from his face, and then, abruptly, Charles halted. He stood calm and unhurried, forcing the old master to look up and meet his gaze. In that frozen instant, Zhang Sanfeng grasped a truth whispered throughout the martial world. Fists, no matter how finely honed, cannot withstand the raw vigor of youth. Charles's seemingly chaotic style had no wasted motion. Every limb became a weapon, every strike too swift for a counter. Charles's technique was all about speed and power, no frills, no form, just a killing blow delivered with ruthless efficiency. This wasn't martial arts in the traditional sense. It was a method devised purely to end a fight at the least possible cost. When had such a merciless fighter ever shown up on the battlefield before? Swish, swish! Zhang Sanfeng staggered back, sweat and blood mingling on his brow as he panted violently. "Boy," he coughed, "you've won. What do you call that punch of yours?" Charles studied the spot where their fists had clashed, replaying every twist and rotation he'd improvised in the heat of combat, movements he'd never seen in any manual or school from his former life. "It has no name," he replied quietly. "It came to me in battle. There simply isn't a name for it." He shook his head, eyes steady. "That's all there is to it." Chapter 334. Gathering Martial Arts. A hush fell over the arena, then rippled into excited murmurs. "He invented that himself? Another prodigy," someone whispered. At the center platform stood Charles, his newly forged martial art gleaming in every fluid motion. He had just dispatched his opponent so decisively that there'd been no chance for a counter, proof of a self-created style on par with the great lineages of old. From the back of the crowd, a tall figure in flowing black robes emerged, Zhang Sanfeng, the venerable founder of Taijiquan. Though age had silvered his hair and etched lines around his eyes, his gaze remained piercing. He approached Charles with visible surprise. Youth rarely achieved such mastery, let alone crafted an entire system. "Young friend," Zhang Sanfeng said, voice warm with admiration, "your talent is astonishing." Charles inclined his head respectfully. "I am honored by your praise, senior. Perhaps my strength and flexibility in youth gave me an edge. But your Taijiquan, its subtle turn of defense into offense, the way it converts an opponent's force, is nothing short of miraculous." A knowing smile curved Zhang Sanfeng's lips. He recognized in Charles's technique the same underlying principles he himself had unearthed centuries ago. Here, before him, stood a young man whose genius rivaled the greatest masters, a new ancestor in the endless pursuit of martial excellence. Charles watched in fascination as two legendary figures, both claiming the name Zhang Sanfeng, unfurled their styles before him. One insisted there were no fixed joints or rigid forms in true martial artistry. The other swore by the same principle. But Charles wasn't convinced. These weren't mere storytellers or mercenary swordsmen. Long ago, in one of his past lives, he had heard of masters just like them, mystics who wielded both internal energy and effortless grace. Now, in the so-called Kingdom of Flowers, a realm that clearly stood in for China, Charles was beginning to realize just how many secrets he'd yet to uncover. The two Zhang Sanfengs finished their cordial duel and immediately fell into deep conversation about yielding to force, about the intangible currents that bind every strike and block. Charles felt a pang of envy. Their deft use of softness to counteract hardness was exactly the sort of technique he longed to master. He made up his mind to seek out their tutelage. Martial arts were almost unheard of in this pirate-ridden world. Aside from Charles's personal curiosity, very few here could match a disciplined martial artist. Even the vaunted Navy Six styles, practiced by officers in the Imperial fleet, owed their reputation to anyone who had experienced them firsthand. Yet the Kingdom of Flowers boasted even greater legacies. Rumor spoke of the Eight Treasures Navy and its secret Bakyong fist, an art so refined it was said to open pathways all the way to the New World. Masters whispered about hidden scrolls and forbidden techniques, each more tantalizing than the last. Standing amid this confluence of tradition and power, Charles realized how little time he'd spent pursuing real martial skill. He needed to stay, at least until he had thoroughly studied the Kingdom of Flowers' greatest arts. Only then could he hope to stand among peers in this violent, unpredictable world of pirates and navies. And so, with renewed purpose, Charles set his course, first to Zhang Sanfeng's side, and then to mastery. Charles cast a determined glance at the heads of the other sex, his eyes ablaze. The spectators around him stiffened at the intensity of his stare. "Thank you, Master Zhang, for your guidance," he said, bowing deeply. He had spent hours in conversation with Zhang Sanfeng, soaking up every nuance of Taijiquan philosophy. Charles now understood that the art contained no fixed sequences to memorize. True mastery came only through personal insight and self-discovery. His heart sank. He had hoped for a more structured curriculum, something he could learn quickly to tip the scales in his favor. Facing adversaries Lai, Kigarp, Sengoku, Zephyr, or Admiral Steelbone Sora, warriors famed for their brute strength and straightforward tactics, he believed that the gentle power of Tai Chi could be his greatest weapon. Zhang Sanfeng laughed, a soft, reassuring sound. "You needn't worry," he said, placing a hand on Charles's shoulder. "When I founded this sect, I opened my art to all. There are no secrets hidden here, only the path you must walk yourself." A small smile appeared on Charles's face. Though the journey promised to be long and solitary, he felt a new spark of determination. His real training was only just beginning. Charles bowed his head, cheeks warming with embarrassment at the lofty thoughts that had crossed his mind. Zhang Sanfeng's instruction had been so generous and free of reserve that Charles found himself both deeply grateful and painfully aware of his own shortcomings. His teacher's mastery of stance, technique, and inner energy still far surpassed anything Charles could hope to achieve. That morning, Zhang Sanfeng had first demonstrated the elegant boxing forms unique to the Land of Flowers. Then, inviting Charles to spar, he guided each movement with patience and precision. After a few spirited rounds, they settled beside a quiet pond, poring over every detail of posture and intent. By the time they finally rose, the sun had already begun its descent. "It was I who saved a gentleman's reputation with the heart of a rogue," Zhang Sanfeng teased, clapping Charles warmly on the shoulder. "Though my spirit may bear a villain's stain, my loyalty lies with those who seek true skill." Charles swallowed, his gratitude mingling with awe. "This journey to the Land of Flowers has been more than worthwhile. I have learned so much from your art, Master Zhang, seen a style I could never have imagined." Zhang Sanfeng smiled. "Then go at your own pace, young friend." He walked Charles to the estate's gate, neither urging him to stay nor offering further instruction. Under the silver sweep of moonlight, he watched Charles's slender figure blend into the night. A shadow of concern flickered across the old master's eyes, but he made no sound, simply standing there until Charles vanished from sight. Zhang Sanfeng muttered under his breath, "I really can't tell whether his arrival will be a blessing or a curse for the martial world of this kingdom." The old master sensed the fierce ambition blazing in the stranger's eyes, and he knew that peace here wouldn't last much longer. Sure enough, the very next day, the young man reappeared at the Wing Chun Pavilion, demanding to be taught their secrets. Master Ye politely refused, and the situation escalated into a duel. As expected, Master Ye, an expert in his own right, was soundly defeated. But to Zhang Sanfeng's relief, the stranger spared his life. What Zhang Sanfeng couldn't have guessed was that the stranger, whose true name was Charles, possessed an extraordinary ability. He could read minds. The moment Master Yi's defenses fell, Charles delved into his opponent's memories and extracted the entire Wing Chun manual, storing every technique in his own mind. Satisfied, Charles turned tail and left. From that day on, he set himself a strict routine. Each dawn, he would appear at a different martial arts sect, issue one simple demand: hand over your secret manual, or fight me, and be on his way. If the sect complied, Charles never harmed a hair on their heads. If they refused, he destroyed their strongest fighters before departing. Most sects quickly learned to pay up. Only a few, like the proud Shaolin Temple, refused to bow, and so Charles's legend continued to grow. The silent boy who collected every fighting art in the Kingdom of Flowers, one defeated sect at a time. Charles strode into the sect's council chamber to request their guidance, but the elders wouldn't even grant him an audience. They knew of his burgeoning strength in the pirate world, so instead of words, they sent their own disciples, 108 of them, to form a deadly formation and stop him in his tracks. This was Charles's first encounter with a formation in the pirate world, and at first he hesitated. The disciples moved in perfect unison, their breaths linked as they channeled all their chi into a single towering staff. In that moment, the weapon seemed to shake the heavens, its power rivaling his own. Alarm bells rang in Charles's mind. If he reacted carelessly, he could be crushed by that unified strike. Steadying himself, Charles drew his 7-star sword. In one decisive sweep, he cleaved through the staff, shattering it instantly, and sent all 108 cultivators tumbling lifeless to the ground. When Zhang Sanfeng heard what had happened, he stood silently in the Grand Martial Hall, letting out a heavy sigh. At noon, he poured himself 3 generous bowls of wine and drank them down, each mouthful laden with remorse and resignation. After defeating 108 opponents, Charles's fascination with Shaolin only deepened. A few days later, he slipped past the outer gates of the monastery and entered the main hall. There, the abbot sat before the Buddha statue, eyes closed in tranquil recitation of the sutras. When Charles drew near, the abbot opened his eyes but made no motion to stop him. Instead, he rose with deliberate calm and offered Charles a respectful nod. Charles hesitated, surprised by the abbot's serene composure, but followed him without a word as they wound their way toward the courtyard. He wasn't worried by any hidden traps, proving one's strength rendered all schemes futile. As they stepped into the open air, dozens of monks in shaven heads fell silent, their gazes cool and unyielding. Charles met each of them with a steady, confident smile. Chapter 335, Gathering the Martial Arts. Charles stepped into a small courtyard tucked away behind the temple's main halls. Ahead of him stood a modest outbuilding, its doors flanked by 3 bold characters carved above the lintel, Sutra Pavilion. At once, a senior monk approached, bowing low. "Your Excellency," he intoned, voice respectful, "all of Shaolin's martial arts manuals are kept within this pavilion. Please, feel free to peruse them at your leisure. Spare us no concern." From inside, Abbot Xuanzi emerged. His face wore a compassionate, almost sorrowful expression. Around him, the monks fell silent for a moment, then began chanting his honorific, "Dai! Dai!" Their mournful chorus so over the top that Charles felt the corners of his mouth twitch in disbelief. He prided himself on his own duplicity, but even he had never witnessed such shameless hypocrisy. Charles returned the abbot's gesture with a simple bow. Abbot Dai. Silently, he pushed open the pavilion doors and stepped inside. Rows upon rows of wooden shelves stretched into the shadows, each shelf laden with scrolls and bound codices. The sheer volume of texts was staggering. Now he understood why the abbot had shown no hesitation. Who could possibly oversee such an immense collection? Curious, Charles pulled a random book from the shelf, cracked it open, and began to read. The words were cramped but clear. Techniques, stances, breathing exercises. He flipped through a few more pages, his brow knitting in confusion. This was supposed to be the pinnacle of Shaolin martial wisdom? So basic, so straightforward, it hardly matched the legendary reputation he had expected. He closed the book, determining to explore further, if only to discover the hidden depth behind these deceptively simple words. Charles flipped through the book at random, eager to uncover some hidden secret of true energy, only to find, much to his dismay, that it was nothing more than a manual of body conditioning exercises. These techniques polished the physique and generated shock waves by channeling power through various muscle groups, but they weren't the transcendental arts he'd imagined. In fact, They weren't so different from the drills he already practiced. A flash of disappointment hit him. This was the pirate world, after all, not a mystical kung fu saga, and at their highest level, these moves were barely on par with the Navy's famed 6 styles. The sheer volume of drills made his head throb. With a sigh, he closed the book and turned instead to the grand teachings of the sea god Poseidon. Summoning a dozen scribes, Charles set them to work on transcribing the Poseidon scriptures. The abbot overseeing the task stared at him with a twitching lip, but Charles merely bowed, murmured "Namo Amituofo" under his breath, and strode away. He knew the simplest way to keep the peace was to let them busy themselves far from prying eyes. Over the next several days, Charles divided his time between supervising the transcriptions and sneaking back to the martial arts manual. He dreamed of gathering techniques from 100 different schools, forging them into a single, unbeatable art. But the more he studied, the more he realized how vast the gulf was between theory and mastery. Ambition alone would not be enough. If he truly wanted to revolutionize his combat style, he'd have to start refining each move from the ground up. And that journey, he now understood, would be far more difficult than he'd ever imagined. The word spread like wildfire. Someone had descended on Shaolin and slaughtered every monk. Late one afternoon in a crowded tavern, a group of travelers leaned across the rough-hewn tables, speaking in stunned whispers. "Did you hear? Shaolin's been wiped out, every last one of them." Impossible. Nothing's impossible these days. It's all over the Taoist halls. They say it was that bearded stranger, the same man who once dared to face Zhang Sanmao. First Wudong fell, then Shaolin. Now every major sect's top masters have been routed by him. He's clearly laying the groundwork to unite the martial world under his banner. Patrons shook their heads in alarm, cups rattling as they gestured toward the door, half expecting the fearsome newcomer to burst in at any moment. In the inner court of the Forbidden Palace, the chief eunuch bowed deeply before the throne, his face pale but his voice steady. "Your Majesty, urgent news." He produced a scroll and offered it. "Captain Charles Rockefeller of the Rockefeller Pirates has issued a challenge to every martial sect. First Wudong, then Shaolin. He's defeated them all. No one in the land can stand against him." The emperor set aside the memorial in his lap and studied the empty hall beyond his raised dice. His brow furrowed. His ambition knows no bounds. What could he hope to gain from this bloody crusade? The eunuch met the emperor's gaze. "It appears His Excellency seeks to collect, to bring every martial art under his control, Your Majesty." He paused. "If so, the very balance of power in the realm is at stake." The emperor fell silent, the candlelight flickering across carved dragons on the lacquered floor. Outside, the rumble of brewing conflict echoed through the palace gates and across the entire martial world. The chief eunuch bowed low before the throne. "Your Majesty, only Charles Rockefeller has managed to collect the complete Shaolin martial arts manuals so far." The emperor looked up in surprise. "He actually cares about martial arts?" He'd always assumed a man of Charles's standing would have little interest in those old monk-taught techniques. "As long as he causes no trouble, shall we let him continue?" the eunuch ventured. The emperor waved him away with a bored flick of his hand. "Very well, dismissed." Over the next 10 days, Charles scoured every corner of the Flower Kingdom, tracking down nearly every renowned Shaolin treatise. He had them bound into a single imposing volume. That afternoon, in Robert Rockefeller's private study, the younger boys pressed around their father in anxious curiosity. Charles held up the thick, leather-bound tome. "Father, what's this?" Robert glanced at the book and sighed. "These are the martial arts styles you're expected to learn." The boys turned pale at the sight of the heavy volume. One of them blurted, "Father, are you serious? We have to master all of this?" Robert pointed to the shelves lining the walls, each groaning under similar tomes. "Don't panic. You don't have to become experts in every style. Just choose the ones that suit you best." Charles merely nodded and returned to his desk, unfazed by the stir he'd caused. Caesar frowned as he scanned the long rows of bookshelves. Then a bright green cover caught his eye. Dragon Claw Hand. He pulled it down, flipped through the pages, and grinned. This was a specialized grappling technique, exactly the kind of gongfa his father had been talking about ever since they began their training. Book in hand, Caesar hurried over to his older brother Charles. "Charles, this technique is perfect for me. May I learn it?" Charles raised an eyebrow in surprise. When had Caesar ever taken the initiative like this? Maybe those restorative rations at lunch were finally kicking in. Still, Charles glanced at the manual and nodded. Dragonclaw hand did indeed suit Caesar's cultivation style. "All right," Charles said. "Go ahead and practice it. If you run into any questions, just ask me." To Charles, the mechanics of the technique were straightforward, just another way to channel force. So he turned away almost immediately. Caesar beamed and settled into a nearby alcove to study the manual. Seeing their eldest brother already absorbed in his own exercises, the others drifted to the shelves in search of manuals tailored to their own talents. Estes, eager for swordplay, promptly pulled down a blade technique guide. Charles flipped open a random volume, and immediately a spark of excitement hit him. The book contained detailed swordsmanship techniques, exactly what his young trainees needed right now. Around him, each crew member had already found a book and settled down to study. Charles simply stepped back and let them learn. He hadn't gathered these manuals just to bulk up their fighting power. In his previous life, his training methods had been brutally unstructured, making apprentices hold up mountains for strength drills or throwing devil fruit users into the open sea to toughen them up. Clearly, those tactics were neither practical nor safe for a team so young. After all, aside from someone like Tesla, who could actually withstand the ocean's depths, who would survive such a trial? Now, with this growing library in the Kingdom of Flowers, Charles finally had a systematic approach. These books were the foundation he'd been after, clear, step-by-step guides that cut through the guesswork. Once he'd organized and integrated their lessons, his crew could progress at their own pace. He commissioned a grand bookshelf in the main hall, each shelf custom-sized to fit the growing collection. From that point on, every member under his command could browse, borrow, and practice whenever they chose. Charles refused to hand out rigid daily drills. In his hall, the only rule was simple. If you want to learn, just pick up a book and start. Charles looked over the stack of manuals with a frown. These techniques aren't like something you can master just by reading. Think of them like naval protocols, he said. You still need hands-on training. Even the cleverest shortcuts won't help if you don't have the talent. It's like Tai Chi, simple on the surface, but you only understand it through practice. He turned to Barrett. From now on, let the crew borrow these manuals if they want, but under no circumstances are they to photocopy or circulate them. Barrett nodded, curious. He picked one of the thinner booklets at random, flipped it open, and began to read aloud. Mighty Vajra Palm, a lethal palm strike that channels your internal force into a concussive shockwave, strong enough to split stone and fissure rock. As Barrett's eyes widened, Charles closed the distance, prepared to test just how powerful this cheat might become in the right hands. Chapter 336, Martial Pavilion. Barrett's eyes widened as he studied the slender volume in his hands. It was a technique manual, remarkably similar to the famed C6 palm style. A specialized form of palm combat that unleashed concussive shockwaves with every strike. Barrett still remembered vividly the legendary duel 2 years ago between the captain and Admiral Ziffa. For nearly 5 days they traded blows, each palm blast shaking the heavens. To hold anything even remotely related to that technique felt like clutching lightning itself. Charles watched Barrett's expression with a knowing smile. He had always been an open book. Any flicker of excitement or doubt showed plainly on his face. Here, Charles said, stepping forward. Take it and practice. Trust me, this will do you good. Thank you, Captain, Barrett replied, bowing deeply as Charles pressed the manual into his grip. Around them, the rest of the crew gathered eagerly, each clutching their own new treatise. Within minutes, Charles had ordered the ship's network to upload every combat manual for open access. Word spread like wildfire through the corridors. What? Captain actually brought a cache of training manuals for us all to use? Is this for real? Stop stalling and get up to the third deck. The Martial Pavilion's waiting. In an instant, the crew dispersed in a flurry of excitement, each person eager to master their new techniques. On board the starship Horizon's Pride, martial prowess was about to reach unprecedented heights. The captain personally cleared out an entire room stacked with cheat books he'd been hoarding. "If you don't hurry, they'll all be gone," one of the crew shouted down the corridor. "Then what are we waiting for? Let's move," another cried, and in an instant the news of the secret manuals spread like wildfire. Every crew member stamped toward the martial arts pavilion, known as the Wu Pavilion, where Charles had hidden the books. By the time they reached the third-floor hallway, bodies were pressed shoulder to shoulder. "Great," muttered a latecomer, jostling for space. "How on earth do we get in?" "Stay in line, one person at a time," Olga called, perched atop a desk and blowing into a bullhorn. "You can borrow any book, but no passing it around. And watch your hands. These books are priceless." Chaos swirled around her, but suddenly a triumphant laugh cut through the noise. "Ha! I've got a swordsmanship manual." Heads turned as a young crewman brandished a worn volume aloft. With a grin, he elbowed his way to Olga's table and slammed the book down. "Blaster sword, right?" he asked, voice brimming with excitement. "What's the author's name again?" Olga scribbled swiftly on her register, while the crewman patted the book protectively. All around them, others clamored for their turn, each determined to snatch the next secret to mastery. "Which squad is this for, and how long does the course last?" At the pavilion's entrance, a newcomer leaned forward, eyes bright with anticipation. Olga sprang into action, sliding off her stool and grabbing a pen and registration form. The newcomer, clutching a copy of the Blasting Gale Rapid Sword Manual, scribbled down his details in a frenzy, then bolted out of the martial arts pavilion, the book hugged tightly against his chest. Standing atop the registration table, Olga banged her fist for attention. "One book per person, everyone. No hoarding. As our captain said, no taking more than your fair share. Master each technique before you move on." Her voice reverberated through the hall, and in an instant, the assembled hopefuls plunged into the maze of shelves, hunting for the perfect cheat manual. With hundreds of volumes to sift through, an eerie silence settled over the pavilion. No one emerged for what felt like hours. Outside, those still in line shifted restlessly, their whispered curses growing louder by the minute. High above it all, in the Rockefeller Pirates' captain's quarters, Charles reclined in his chair, eyes fixed on the surveillance monitors. A small satisfied smile curved his lips. "Just the kind of energy we need," he murmured, leaning back. Since joining the Rockefeller Pirates, he'd seen his crew blaze a trail through the North Sea and the Western Sea, especially after their decisive victory over Zephyr in the North Sea. With talent and enthusiasm like this, their future looked brighter than ever. The crew's dedication was slipping. Every day, their training sessions grew more lackluster, and Charles could feel their focus drifting. If this went on, they'd lose the edge that made them the Rockefeller Pirates' elite fighting force. To prevent that, Charles kept staging mock battles, just enough to keep their skills sharp without wearing them out completely. Those cheats he'd introduced, a series of specialized drills and techniques, were designed to give the crew concrete goals. As long as they committed to the training regimen, their abilities would steadily improve. After all, these men and women weren't ordinary deckhands. They were hand-picked veterans, as valuable to Charles as the Navy's finest soldiers. It would be a waste to let their talents go unpolished. "Captain, I truly believe these new methods will transform the Rockefeller Pirates into a force to be reckoned with," Caesar Courant said eagerly. His eyes shone with anticipation. "Once we set sail for the New World, we'll make everyone there quake in their boots." Charles smiled at Caesar's enthusiasm. "I'm looking forward to it too. But before we get ahead of ourselves," he paused, his expression shifting. "How are those devil fruit experiments coming along?" Caesar's broad grin faltered. He swallowed, brow furrowing. "About those, Captain, the samples you provided haven't yielded the results we hoped for. I'm afraid the outcomes are unsatisfactory." Charles inclined his head, studying Caesar's tense posture. The stakes were high. If the devil fruit trials failed, the entire plan to bolster the crew's power could falter before it even began. Yet Charles remained outwardly calm. There was still time to adjust the formulas and refine the process. After all, every great inventor met setbacks. What mattered was the breakthrough that followed. Charles paced the length of the laboratory, irritation flickering across his brow. Only a 10% success rate. and every single one is an animal-type fruit. Some don't even fully awaken their beast powers, just half-baked, useless defects. Caesar Caron exchanged an uneasy glance before reporting sheepishly, "I assure you, Captain, I wouldn't mislead you." Charles's frown deepened. "Show me the specimens." He turned on his heel and strode toward the heart of the complex. Caesar quickened his pace to keep up. The entire 7th floor of the facility had been converted at Charles's command into a sprawling research center. White-coated scientists huddled around gleaming workbenches, while banks of glass display cases lined the walls. Beyond the main lab lay a secure chamber that served as both storage vault and prison. As Charles and Caesar approached, the sharp tang of chemical reagents stung their nostrils. Heads snapped up at the sight of their captain. "Captain!" Several voices chimed in unison. Charles offered curt nods and pressed on. Caesar led him first to a row of containment cells showcasing dozens of half-formed devil fruits. Some resembled small, furry creatures, others looked like shells or feathers trapped in amber. Many bore cracks or misshapen patterns, proof, Charles thought grimly, of the project's alarming failure rate. They continued past the display cases and arrived at the prison wing, a series of cells carved from impenetrable Hylus stone. Dozens of ragged figures crowded against their bars, faces pale and desperate. At the sight of Charles, they erupted into frantic shouting. "Let me out, please. We swear we'll behave." "Damn you, Rockefeller pirates! Damn you, Captain Charles!" Their curses and pleas echoed through the corridor, a cacophony of fear and anger. Charles regarded them with cool detachment. There would be time later to deal with these prisoners. Now, his full attention was on those failed fruits, and on finding a way to turn this project's fortunes around. Charles glanced down at the prisoner who spat curses from behind the cell bars. "Bring him out," he ordered without breaking stride. "He looks healthy enough, perfect for our next experiment." With that, he continued on. Commander Caesar Corrant watched the exchange with thinly veiled pity, shaking his head at Charles's casual cruelty. The pirate slave trader in the cell fell silent, his bravado vanishing as he realized the true cost of catching the captain's attention. For Caesar, men like this were nothing more than expendable test subjects. Ever since Charles had instructed him to round up any scoundrel floating their way at sea, they'd had a steady supply of captives. The experiments progressed rapidly, often with grisly setbacks, but Caesar was convinced that, given a few more years, they'd finally engineer a genuine man-made devil fruit. They paused at a reinforced door marked Special Containment. Inside, an unconscious man hung suspended by Seastone shackles, hands and feet locked fast. His body swayed gently, utterly motionless otherwise. Charles tapped the door. "Report." Lieutenant Hargrove saluted. "Captain Charles, the subject's mind is gone. He's completely unresponsive, no signs of awareness or recovery." Charles studied the limp form for a long moment. "All right, prepare him for the next phase. We may yet learn something from his breakdown." Caesar exhaled softly. In the dim light of the lab, surrounded by humming machinery and vials of strange liquids, they pressed on, ever closer to their goal of creating the ultimate devil fruit. "I've put him into a deep sleep." Caesar Corrant studied the small experimental device in his hand, then glanced at the unconscious man slumped in the chair. Charles watched him intently and gave a brief nod. "Okay," Charles said, voice calm but expectant. "Now wake him up. I want to see how well it works." "Right away," Caesar replied. He moved quickly to the control panel of the device and began the activation sequence. Chapter 337, The Weapon That Devoured the Devil Fruit. Through the thick glass of the containment cell, Caesar Corrant exhaled a cloud of pale smoke. The prisoner inside inhaled sharply, his body jolting with each breath. Gradually, he forced his eyes open, only to reveal pupils rimmed with crimson, bloodshot veins branching across the whites. His jaw snapped wide, unleashing a mouthful of serrated, animalistic fangs as a hoarse growl built in his throat. "Drink," he rasped. "Drink." The guttural plea transformed instantly into a bestial roar. He thrashed against his chains, the metal links clinking in frenzied protest. "Let's see what he's truly capable of," Charles barked. At once, Caesar's hand swept through the air, breaking the Hylushi suppression seal that had bound the prisoner's power. The man's writhing convulsions intensified. Where there had once been only a single, confined figure, now erupted a monstrous chimera. 8 sinewy tentacles burst from his back, each tipped with razor-sharp barbs. A crooked horn spiraled from his forehead, glistening under the harsh cell lights. His limbs thickened with muscle, fur sprouted across his shoulders, and his face contorted into a savage blend of leopard snarls and jackal grins. 5 or 6 distinct creatures merged into one horrifying form. A thunderous roar shook the chamber. The beast lunged at the reinforced walls, forcing Charles to step back. He closed his eyes, bracing himself against the sheer, untamed ferocity before him. Charles recoiled at the sight before him, something so grotesque it made his stomach churn. The creature in the cell writhed in impossible angles, its limbs knotted and misshapen. He swallowed the bile rising in his throat and turned to Caesar Courant. "What is that monstrosity?" Caesar's face went ashen. He ran a hand through his hair, guilt etched in every line of his expression. "I miscalculated the bloodline parameters on this one," he admitted, voice tight. "It became corrupted, but I've already corrected the flaw. My next prototype will behave as intended, I promise." Charles studied him coolly, fighting down his revulsion. "Words won't prove its strength. Bring me a death row inmate, one desperate enough to serve as real prey. I want to see how this abomination fights." Without another word, Caesar ducked out. A few minutes later, he returned flanked by armed guards, escorting the gaunt prisoner who had earlier dared to insult his own captain. The man spat defiantly as he was shoved toward the steel gate. "Let go of me, you lunatics! I'll—" Caesar cut him off with a steely glance. He lifted a heavy hunting knife from the nearby bench, hefted it in his hand, then flung both blade and prisoner into the cell. The gate slammed shut with a deafening clang. Silence fell over the laboratory, broken only by the convict's frantic scrambling and the creature's low, wet growl. Charles pressed forward, every sense on edge, as the true nature of Caesar's experiment began to unfold. Caesar Courant strode into the control room and fixed his gaze on Charles, who lay huddled on the floor, too terrified to move. "Get up," Caesar ordered. "Stand and pick up that weapon. I'm about to install an experimental device. If you can kill the creature awaiting you, you'll earn your freedom." Charles's heart pounded as the command crackled over the radio in his cell. He forced himself upright, glancing around the empty chamber with its smooth, unbroken walls. One hand trembling, he knelt to retrieve the heavy knife he'd dropped moments before. Caesar nodded in approval and pressed a button on the console. With a whir of hydraulics, a section of wall swung open. The restraints binding the stitched-together creature snapped loose, and it collapsed to the floor with a deafening crash. Charles froze as a thick, sinewy tentacle, no thicker than a human thigh, slithered out of the darkness. "What is that?" Charles whispered, horror rooting him in place. He stumbled backward, his retreat catching the creature's attention. In an instant, it lunged. "Help! Help!" The man pounded on the reinforced glass, his voice cracking with terror. He had no hope of escape. Across the chamber, the engineered creature, its fangs slick with saliva, lunged forward. In an instant, it tore him limb from limb and devoured him as ruthlessly as a wild animal. Charles's stomach churned. He looked away, his face pale. Beside him, Caesar Courant pressed closer to the monitor, eyes shining with morbid delight at every gruesome detail. "Why are we even doing this?" Charles said, his voice cold. "What purpose does it serve to turn a human into bait?" Caesar's exhilaration vanished under Charles's steely glare. He swallowed, struggling for words. "Don't tell me, after all the time and resources you poured into this project, this is the result?" Charles pressed on. "Captain, I admit I haven't succeeded in synthesizing an artificial devil fruit," Caesar stammered, shoulders slumping. "But the experiment wasn't entirely in vain. I made an unexpected discovery." Charles folded his arms and raised a brow. "Oh, you found something useful at last? Because if it's not worth our efforts, I'll have to rethink your research budget." Caesar straightened, determination replacing his earlier defeat. "Sir, you'll want to hear what I learned." Charles nodded once. "Very well. Explain." Charles clenched his jaw. "We need to keep the pressure on him, or he'll never make a move." At Charles's command, Caesar Courant bounded out of the laboratory and returned in seconds, cradling a weapon he'd retrieved from a Hylushi-lined crate. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary knife. Charles raised an eyebrow. "What's so special about this blade?" Grinning wildly, Caesar hurried forward and held the knife out for inspection. "Captain, you won't believe this, but it devoured a devil fruit. Not living creatures alone. Apparently even inanimate things can eat devil fruits and gain their powers." The moment Charles heard it, he knew exactly what he was looking at. "A devil fruit weapon," he breathed. "Exactly." Caesar exclaimed. He lifted the knife, and the steel blade began to twist and contort. In a flash, it reshaped itself into a snarling white bear, the very same white bear fruit that had changed hands at the auction not long ago. Charles's pulse quickened as he snatched the transformed weapon. Energy pulsed through his fingertips. "A devil fruit weapon," he repeated, marveling at its weight and balance. "How powerful is it?" "It's on par with the Great Cleaver Model 21, Caesar replied confidently. "Actually, it's even stronger than a regular Big Cleaver 21. Charles nodded, a gleam of determination in his eyes. With this newfound power at his side, the next move would be theirs. Charles's eyes widened as he watched the white bear's arm morph into a massive cleaver. "It has a special ability," he exclaimed. Captain Caesar Current leaned forward, interest alight in his gaze. "And what's the success rate?" Charles paused, heart pounding with excitement. Ever since his previous life, he'd been obsessed with the idea of fusing devil fruit powers with conventional weapons, especially firearms, but the technology had always seemed out of reach. Then, by pure chance, Caesar had stumbled onto a method. "For Zoan-type fruits, it's 100%, Caesar replied confidently. "Paramecia and Logia are untested. We don't know yet if the process will succeed, but it's worth a shot." Charles's mind raced. He knew exactly how many devil fruits he had in storage, each one a potential key to this breakthrough. "Very well," he said, steepling his fingers. "I want you to forge a weapon capable of channeling superhuman devil fruit abilities. A gun, ideally, something that grants its bearer those powers with each shot. Can you do it?" Caesar's grin was all the answer Charles needed. "As long as you supply enough devil fruits, I'll make it happen." Chapter 338, Devil Fruit Weaponry Speculation. Charles leaned back, turning over in his mind the devil fruits he'd gathered, each one a potential revolution in armaments. His thoughts drifted to the legendary castle fruit, a fanfiction favorite from his past life. In those stories, consuming the castle fruit granted the user a self-contained fortress, a portable stronghold not unlike a pocket dimension. If such a concept could exist, why not apply it elsewhere? In his arsenal were fruits that manipulated mass and momentum. The press fruit, which could heap unimaginable weight onto any object, and the slow fruit, capable of sapping speed with a mere touch. Charles imagined his prized 7-star sword infused with the press fruit's burden, its blows landing with irresistible force, or imbibing the slow fruit, turning every strike into a crushing, inescapable assault. The battlefield advantages would be staggering. He also considered the Zoan type, or animal, devil fruits. What if a cannon, or even an entire volley of muskets, were to consume such a fruit? Each weapon could awaken as a living siege engine, a mobile fortress that prowls the field, its barrels firing from armored flanks. Equipping his children with these devil fruit-enhanced weapons would instantly elevate their combat capabilities to legendary status. The more Charles mulled over the idea, the stronger his conviction grew. These organically empowered arms outmatched any dream of artificial devil fruits. Though no man-made replicas had yet appeared, the age of devil fruit weaponry was dawning, and all that remained was to prove the theory in practice. With experimentation on the horizon, Charles felt certain that his bold vision would soon reshape warfare itself. Charles paced back and forth in the lab, eyes fixed on Caesar Current. "Caesar," he said, voice crisp with command, "your only task now is to figure out how to fuse a superhuman devil fruit with our equipment. We need a solution, and fast. Can you handle it?" Caesar's face lit up. He snapped to attention and saluted. "You have my word, Captain. I'll crack the problem." "Good," Charles replied, offering a rare smile. "Once you succeed, I'll secure you the perfect devil fruit and a substantial reward." "Thank you, Captain." Caesar practically vibrated with excitement. He'd always dreamed of wielding devil fruit power, ever since rumors of Dr. Vegapunk's breakthroughs had swept the Grand Line. If anyone could push evolution forward with fruit-infused technology, it was Vegapunk. And now, under Charles's command, Caesar might claim that power for himself. With Caesar dispatched to the research deck, Charles returned to the bank of holoscreens lining one wall. He sifted through experimental logs, genetic analyses, prototype schematics, anything that might spark a breakthrough. But among all those records, one project stood out above the rest: the artificial soldiers. Cold, unfeeling automatons programmed only for combat, the artificial soldiers operated without rest or hesitation and without conscience. In the war fronts ahead, Charles knew that raw manpower was the one thing he lacked compared to other pirate lords. Armies of tireless, mindless fighters could shift the balance of power overnight. If he could somehow merge devil fruit abilities into these constructs, he'd create an unstoppable force. His finger hovered over the deploy icon on the nearest console. The real challenge lay ahead, taking that first step from blueprint to battlefield. But with Caesar Current, now fiercely motivated, and the promise of a true devil fruit at stake, Charles felt a surge of confidence. The future belonged to those bold enough to reshape nature itself, and he intended to lead the way. Chapter 7. A New Line of Descent. The fallout from the Age of Discovery had been harsher than anyone had anticipated. Charles stared out over the rolling hills of Beihai, troubled by the fact that he only had a few thousand soldiers to defend the entire territory. Recruiting rank-and-file pirates had once been easy. Now he needed an elite force, men and women whose loyalty and skill would stand up to any threat. His thoughts turned immediately to Wensmoke Gage's artificial soldiers. Gage had pioneered a program of biomechanical infantry so formidable they were nearly unstoppable, but the moment the scientist left Beihai, the project ground to a halt. Charles found himself missing Gage's razor-sharp genius. For an instant, he even considered sending a team to snatch the scientist from wherever he might be hiding. Then he remembered his promise. Gage had been granted safe passage, and Charles was a man of his word. He closed his eyes, drawing a slow breath. "No," he said, "we must find another way." Rallying his advisors, Charles resolved to seek out other brilliant minds. Engineers, alchemists, any researcher willing to push the boundaries of craft and creation. At the same time, he would inspect the remnants of the old artificial soldier program himself. Perhaps in the lab archives there lurked blueprints or half-finished prototypes that could be resurrected. That afternoon, Charles stepped into the vast subterranean workshop where the so-called scientific core had once toiled. Long tables held rusted servomotors and tattered schematics. Half-assembled combat frames lay dormant, their optic receptors dark. Yet here and there, sparks of hope ignited. Tinkering automatons quietly scuttled across the floor, and a handful of junior engineers, Charles's new recruits, pored over schematics in eager discussion. Meanwhile, Caesar Current, the group's resident alchemical savant, resumed his clandestine experiments with devil fruit weaponry. His research into the genetics of lineage and the potential for blood factor enhancement had deepened in recent weeks. On a raised platform behind Caesar's station stood their most unsettling creation, the stitched monster. Fashioned from multiple cadavers and reinforced with mechanical braces, the creature had been locked in a steel chamber. After its latest feeding, an unfortunate volunteer specimen, it thrashed against the walls, metal plates screeching in protest as its gaunt, patched-together limbs pounded the enclosure. Charles watched from the observation gallery, hand resting lightly on the railing. Each surge of the horrible giant reminded him why he pursued this path, a future where Beihai's armies would be as relentless and unwavering as the tides themselves. He let the monster's roars echo in his ears and turned to Caesar with a determined nod. "Keep going," he said. "We're on the brink of something extraordinary." Charles found the high-low stone walls far more brittle than he'd expected. One firm strike was enough to splinter the surface. After exploring the fortress for a while, he climbed back up to the quarterdeck, a broad smile on his face. The stronghold hadn't matched his every expectation, yet in many respects, it had even exceeded them. Discovering those devil fruit-imbued weapons hidden inside had opened up an entirely new range of possibilities. Once on deck, the crew's excitement was contagious. They threw themselves into martial training, each man and woman pushing their limits with renewed fervor. In the aftermath of Charles's conquest, the Kingdom of Flowers had settled into an uneasy calm. Though he had effectively dismantled its entire martial hierarchy, the kingdom's citizens remained blissfully unaware of his true identity. Only a handful of insiders, those closely tied to the royal court, had pieced together who he might be. When the news reached the great masters Zhang Sanfeng and the Shaolin abbot, both received it in silence. Zhang Sanfeng offered no immediate response. The abbot, however, retrieved an ancient communication device, one he hadn't activated in years, and keyed in a familiar number. "Moses, are you there? It's the Shaolin abbot, calling from the Kingdom of Flowers in the West Sea. I wouldn't trouble you if it weren't urgent, but the Rockefeller pirates have shown up along our coast." Abbot Schwanzi ended the call with a scowl. He'd hoped to lean on the Navy's authority, save face, but instead he'd been told not to worry about the Rockefeller pirates' movements. Welcome to the New World. On the deck of a warship, two middle-aged officers lounged in rocking chairs, each nursing a glass of coconut juice and shaded by dark sunglasses. Captain Garp peered over the rim of his glass. "Sengoku, what was that about the Rockefeller pirates?" Fleet Admiral Sengoku waved one hand dismissively. "It's nothing. Word is they drifted into the West Sea and showed up in the Flower Kingdom. Our contacts there put in a report, and I told them we'd handle it." Garp set his drink down, whistling low. "The Flower Kingdom? That's the West Sea's top power, isn't it?" Sengoku grinned. "Exactly. They're the richest nation out here with the strongest military in these waters." Sengoku leaned closer to Captain Kapu Kopu, his voice low but steady. "You know, our kingdom isn't the only one with elite fighters. Remember the commander of the 8 Treasures Navy you defeated at Qingjiao 2 years ago? He was at least twice as strong as anyone from the Kingdom of Flowers." At Sengoku's remark, Garp shot bolt upright, eyes wide. "Twice as strong? That's astounding. I'm well aware of the Flower Kingdom's strength. Even here at Navy headquarters, their best would rank at admiral level. How could the Kingdom of Flowers possibly field so many like that?" Captain Kappa, capped to his friends, shook his head in disbelief. "The Flower Kingdom's martial heritage runs deep. Their warriors train methodically, advancing step by step. If you have even moderate talent, you can climb all the way to the top of their system. Back when I was in the West Sea, I learned most of my techniques in Shihai, the very region where the Flower Kingdom lies. They're a force you can't underestimate." Sengoku's expression grew thoughtful. "I recall challenging their Shaolin masters in my youth. I picked up several unique forms from them, moves I still rely on to this day." Garp chuckled and slapped his thigh. "Well, that settles it. Next time I'm on leave, I'll pay the Flower Kingdom a visit myself." "I'm heading to the Kingdom of Flowers too," Cap said, his eyes lighting up with genuine excitement. General Warring States shook his head and cracked a wry smile. "A vacation? Right now? We'll worry about sightseeing after we've taken down the Roger pirates." Cap tossed back a grin. "Don't write me off. I'll catch those Roger pirates yet, mark my words." Chapter 339, Leaving the Land of Flowers. After 2 full months in the Land of Flowers, the Rockefeller pirates were at last ready to weigh anchor. Estes and the others had spent their days in the arena, keeping their winning streak intact, while Charles had sequestered himself in the ship's dojo, drilling new martial techniques until his knuckles bled. Now, as the crew bustled to prepare for their next voyage, he felt it was finally time to face his captain, his wife, and the 3 mischievous daughters they'd acquired along the way. "Darling," Charles began, slipping up behind Elena as she sorted through navigation charts with her girls at her side. "It's been over 10 days now. Surely that anger has had time to cool off? Please don't stay mad at me." For the past week and a half, Martha and her 3 girls, Alina, Marissa, and Selena, had all but banished him to an empty cabin, convinced he'd somehow offended them. Charles still wasn't entirely sure what he'd done wrong, but 10 days in solitary confinement on a pirate ship was more than enough to drive anyone to plead for mercy. Elena looked up, her cheeks faintly flushed, but her eyes twinkling with amusement. "Pfft! And what do you plan to tell the girls?" she teased, glancing at her daughters. The youngest, Alina, couldn't resist tugging gently at Charles's coat, as if to seal his pardon with a hug. Around them, the rest of the crew busied themselves with rigging and supplies, strategically avoiding eye contact to give the couple their privacy. Estes, leaning against the rail with her arms crossed, simply rolled her eyes. Ever since she could remember, she'd been utterly speechless at the sight of her parents' open affection. Charles swallowed hard, nodded at Alina, and turned to the girls. "I promise I'll do better," he said, extending a peace offering of bright red roses, picked fresh from Flora's famed gardens, still laden with dew. The girls giggled, and even Martha's stern face softened into a reluctant smile. With kisses planted on foreheads and laughter echoing across the deck, the Rockefeller pirates cast off. The land of flowers slipped beneath the horizon, and once again they set their course for adventure on the open sea. My father is such a flirt, chatting up every woman he meets, yet my mother never gives him the time of day. All right. I've been in the Flowery Coast for 2 months now. It's time we pushed on to our next destination. Barrett, are our supplies all aboard?" Charles snapped to attention and regarded Barrett with renewed seriousness. "Captain, everything is stowed and ready to go." Barrett's voice rang with confidence. They had begun provisioning the instant they set foot on land. After all, a sea voyage demands careful planning, and given the nature of their mission, they could expect the unexpected. With stores and spare gear already packed, they were prepared for any emergency and ready to set sail at a moment's notice. "Very good," Charles said, turning on his heel. "Let's move out." He strode toward the pier, and the rest followed without hesitation. Nearly 100 crewmen walked in formation behind him, heads held high as they headed for the waiting ship. "Are they really leaving?" Qingjiao, Charles's loyal attendant, watched them go with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "It certainly seems that way," her companion replied, eyes fixed on the departing figures. "I suppose the next leg of their journey has begun. They've recalled all the detachments that had been scattered. Our departure should be imminent." The captain of the city guard watched Charles and his companion stride away and let out a relieved whistle. "At last, send word back to His Majesty. Our task here is done." Qingjiao exhaled deeply, the tension of the past 10 days finally draining away. He'd spent every waking hour juggling demands, smoothing over Charles's affairs, and fretting over potential disasters. But the Emperor had promised him a handsome reward, provided Charles caused no more trouble, and Qingjiao could almost taste the riches awaiting. With renewed energy, he turned and hurried back to the palace. Meanwhile, aboard the sea god Poseidon, Charles's small fleet slipped silently out of the Kingdom of Flowers harbor. No sooner had their sails caught the wind than the far-flung agents who'd been shadowing him sprang into action. Across the Red Earth continent, in Pangu City's Mary Joya district at the Wulaoxing office, Satan Sheng peered at the report his CP0 contact had transmitted. "Confirm that Charles has indeed left the Kingdom of Flowers," he ordered. "He has, Lord Sa, and he inflicted no harm upon them," the agent replied without hesitation. Satan Sheng allowed himself the faintest of nods. "Good. Keep watching his course. Report any deviation immediately." With that, the screens went dark and the office fell into tense silence once more. Charles was gone, but his journey had only just begun. CP0's latest report had just come through. Charles spent 2 months in the Kingdom of Flowers, the agent recited. He attended several banquets hosted by the Emperor, but carried out no other activities. Saint Satan tapped his desk with a gloved finger. "Nothing else?" he asked, his voice calm but edged with impatience. "Nothing," CP0 confirmed. "He participated in the court entertainments, and that's it." "All right," Saint Satan said. "Maintain constant surveillance on the Kingdom of Flowers. I want every one of their movements under world government scrutiny." He ended the call and turned to the others in the war room. "Nasi Shoulangsheng," he said, addressing the bald-headed operative known as the Star with a Knife, "has Charles left the Kingdom of Flowers?" Nasi glanced up from the monitors. "Yes, sir," he replied. "Our target set sail earlier today." Saint Satan's brow furrowed. "Do we know his destination?" The room fell silent until the bearded agent Vauchuli spoke. "According to our latest tracings, he's simply circumnavigating the globe." "Then where will he head next?" Satan asked. Vauchuli stepped forward and pointed to a large map pinned on the wall. A series of red lines traced Charles's route across the Western Sea. "Here," Vauchuli said, "is our best estimate of his next port of call." Saint Satan leaned in, studying the map. "Keep me informed," he ordered. "We cannot afford to lose sight of Charles and whatever he might discover, wherever he goes." In the Grand Command Chamber of the World Government, Admiral Satan Sand stared down a sprawling sea chart laid out on the table. Tapping his finger on a distant cluster of islands, he spoke with quiet menace. If they refuse to alter their course, our next target will be Ohara. A low murmur rippled around the room. The bearded Vice Admiral Mashang raised an eyebrow. Ohara? Isn't that the island where those scholars gather? Satan Sand looked up, his voice cold. Precisely. Those archaeologists are said to be searching for the lost century, the 100 years of history erased from every record. If they uncover even a fragment of that forbidden past. He let the threat hang in the air. I want surveillance teams dispatched immediately. The moment they cross the line, eliminate them without a trace. Agreed, several officers chorused in unison. Prepare the Navy's demon slaughter orders, Satan Sand commanded, and stand by for deployment. With that decree, the fate of Ohara was sealed. Its scholars' thirst for truth branded a threat to world stability. Meanwhile, 3 days out from the Flower Kingdom's shores, the warship Sea God Poseidon cleaved through rolling waves. On its deck stood Charles, formerly known as Charlotte, gazing toward the horizon. Each passing moment carried him farther from the land of blossoms and deeper into a world fraught with hidden histories and perilous secrets. The Rockefeller pirates were clearly running out of patience. For 3 days now, not a single pirate crew had appeared on these waters. Their ship drifted in the vast emptiness of the sea, silent, motionless, and utterly boring. This is maddening, Robert groaned, flopping back against the railing as he stared at the unbroken blue horizon. Where are the West Sea pirates? We even flew our flag and posed as a merchant vessel, but no one's come to challenge us. Didara leaned on the rail beside him, his mood as listless as Robert's. Feels like we're in a graveyard out here, nothing but dead water. At their age, idle days were torture. The only thrill these young buccaneers knew was raiding a rival ship and sharing in its treasure. Yet no pirates had shown themselves, and merchant vessels were scarce too. Unbeknownst to them, it was their own handiwork from 2 months ago, when they'd swept through this region and decimated a local pirate fleet that had driven every other band into hiding. That was why the sea lay empty. Oh, how long until we reach the next island? Didara moaned, squinting at the distant skyline. Then, without warning, he straightened up, eyes snapping wide. Look, he shouted, pointing toward the horizon. Something was coming. Something big. Didara squinted. Robert, look over there. Are those 2 ships? He tugged on Robert's sleeve and pointed toward the horizon. Chapter 340, The Pursuit of the CP Organization. Where? Where? Robert cried, his finger trembling as he pointed toward the horizon. Didara followed his gesture, and Robert peered through his spyglass. 2 dark shapes loomed in the distance, growing steadily larger. It looks like they're in combat, he murmured uncertainly. Through the glass, he could just make out a line of world government warships unleashing broadsides at a single vessel flying the Ohara flag. Each salvo struck the sea just short of the target, sending fountains of spray into the air, but failing to score a direct hit. Quick, tell Dad. There's a battle ahead. Robert grabbed Didara's arm and dashed for the captain's cabin. He knew his father, Captain Charles, would be inside, coordinating the fleet's movements. As they burst through the door, Charles was already reviewing reports brought by the crew. He looked up at the lookout posted at the window. So the world government fleet is attacking an Ohara ship, he said. Have you identified who's on board? The lookout shifted uneasily, eyes fixed on the distant combat. Sir, it appears to be a woman. Charles's brow furrowed as he listened to the lookout's call. Sir, the watchman hesitated, there's a small boat bearing down on us. A man and a pregnant woman. At those words, Charles felt a spark of curiosity, though truth be told, it wasn't the woman who drew his interest. How fast are they closing? He demanded. In 10 minutes at this speed, the watchman answered. I'm ordering Condition 1, battle stations. Prepare to engage. Charles nodded and strode for the deck. Understood. Beside him, the signal operator slammed down on the alarm lever. A shrill klaxon rolled through the corridors. Attention! Condition 1. All combatants report to the deck. Enemy vessels inbound. Within moments, soldiers poured out of their quarters, weapons in hand, faces set and grim. Senior officers, Barrett among them, followed close behind. Charles took his place by the rail as distant blasts rocked the sea. Barrett's voice was low, edged with disbelief. World government ships, here, what are they doing in these waters? Before Charles could answer, his gaze flicked back to the small boat, now clearly visible against the foam. On its deck, a desperate scene played out. A man clutching his abdomen collapsed into the arms of the pregnant woman. "Albia!" the wounded man gasped, voice ragged with pain. I'm sorry, I won't be able to." "No," the woman pressed him tight. "You're not going to die. Don't you dare leave me." Her plea echoed over the swell, and for a moment the world of cannon smoke and orders fell away, leaving only the two of them on that tiny deck. Charles felt a knot in his stomach. Whatever their story, whatever fate had brought them here, it was about to crash headlong into the chaos of battle. Olbia's white hair fell in a silken curtain around her shoulders as she knelt beside Charles, cradling his head in her arms. "You haven't even seen our child yet," she sobbed, her voice cracking. "We promised, together, to watch her grow. Please don't leave me, please." Charles reached up, his fingers trembling as they brushed her cheek. "No," he whispered, staring into her eyes. "We vowed to unravel the 100-year blank in history. I can't give up now." Olbia shook her head, the movement so slight it pained her. "My body, I fear I won't last much longer." Her hand dropped to her swollen belly. "Promise me you'll stay with her, that you'll protect her, even if I can't be there." He sagged against her, grief and determination warring in his expression. "I swear it," he said hoarsely. "We'll both survive this, I promise." Warm tears traced tracks down Olbia's cheeks. "Promise me," she repeated, clutching him tighter. "Promise you'll never leave her side." Charles lifted his head as if to speak, but no words came. His eyes glazed over, and his body went still. "Charles?" Her cry echoed in the silent chamber. She pressed her ear to his chest, but felt no heartbeat. A low rumble rolled roughed the hangar bay. Through the viewport beyond them, pursuit ships converged on the station, their searchlights cutting through the darkness. Then a voice crackled over the intercom. "Sir!" Olbia's tears fell unheeded as alarms began to blare, and Charles lay motionless in her arms. Aboard the pursuit ship, a masked officer peered through his telescope. "He's dead," he reported in a low voice. "Keep firing. Anyone who meddles with forbidden knowledge must pay with their life, and do not let that pregnant woman get away." The command chief studied the distant vessel with a hard stare. After a moment, he nodded. "Understood. Eliminate every threat." The deck crews answered his order with another salvo of cannon fire. Each shot roared over the sea, but though the target ship bore no visible pilot, it danced between the blasts, as if protected by some capricious goddess of fortune. Every cannonball splashed into the waves just yards from its hull, and the rising swells only seemed to speed its progress. "Damn it," the chief barked. He yanked an operator aside. "How are they dodging our shots? Get me a straight line of fire." "Sir, the wind's too strong for a precise aim," the nervous gunner admitted, hands trembling on the breech. "Then compensate," the chief snarled, shoving him back. "I want that ship crippled before it disappears over the horizon." The men hurried to adjust their guns. Suddenly, a lookout cried out, "Captain, a massive vessel just appeared on our starboard bow." Before anyone could react, the radar blared, signaling that an even greater threat was closing in fast. The lookout at the rail snapped his binoculars into place and called out, "Sir, what are those vessels? They're enormous. Shall we let them pass?" Commander Park barely glanced at him. In these waters off Shihai, giant ships weren't supposed to trouble him. But as the lookout insisted, a black silhouette grew sharper on the horizon. The commander's eyebrow twitched. "They're coming right at us. Full speed!" The men behind the commander scurried. One officer yanked the binoculars away from the lookout and peered through them himself. The great black hull resolved into a colossal statue of a mermaid, and atop her shoulders stood Poseidon, his trident raised like a challenge to the sky. "By all that's holy," the officer murmured. "It's the Rockefeller pirates." At the name, Commander Park's face went stone cold. The Rockefeller pirates, the fearsome fleet that had been terrorizing shipping lanes throughout the West Sea. He'd never expected to see their colors here. "Why didn't CPO warn us of their approach?" he snarled, clenching his jaw. "Sir?" another officer ventured, voice tight with tension. "Shall we break off the chase?" Park's gaze remained fixed on the looming pirate flagship, its prow cutting through the waves like a blade. He stood silent for a long moment, then squared his shoulders and barked. No, keep pursuing. We'll show them they can't bully Shihai's coasts with impunity. The CP chief's voice crackled over the comms. If you fail this mission, there'll be hell to pay when you get back. He didn't even pause when someone mentioned the Rockefeller pirates might interfere. He simply barked an order. Strike now, before the enemy gets within range. His crew exchanged grim looks and moved with desperate speed, their fingers dancing over the controls as they prepared to eliminate the target before the pirates could even appear. On the lead ship, Olbia stood and faced the world government warship bearing down on them. A cruel spark lit her eyes. She stalked forward to the helm and angled her vessel toward the massive ship looming ahead, hoping its sheer bulk would shield them from the pursuing navy. "Damn it all! Open fire!" she roared. Behind them, the warship's guns thundered in response.